Welcome and thank you for joining today's conference Market Surveillance Committee meeting. All audio lines have been muted until the Q&A portion of the call. To indicate you want to ask a question verbally on WebEx, click the raised hand icon at the bottom center of your screen. You will hear a beep tone when you are unmuted. At that time, state your name and question. If you require technical assistance, please send a chat to the event producer. With that, I'll turn the call over to Dr. Ben Hobbs. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. Hi, I'm Ben Hobbs. I'm chair of the Market Surveillance Committee, and I'm very excited about this meeting today because the issue is an extremely important one that we first talked about at a public meeting last June, the congestion revenue analysis for the extended day-ahead market, which will be kicking off officially on May 1st. Which is very exciting. During this meeting, we're going to have presentations by two staff members. Miloš Bosanac is going to be talking about, in general, some of the issues and questions surrounding congestion revenue allocation. And then Guillermo Batista-Alderete, who's going to be discussing quantitative analysis of the magnitude, extent, distribution of impacts that are as to the extent that they are known at this point. Those will be both very interesting. That will be followed by a presentation by Dr. Scott Harvey of the Market Surveillance Committee. But before we have those presentations and discussion, we will have, as usual, public comment, and I'll be inviting you in just a minute to do that. But prior to the prior comment, I'm very pleased that Anna McKenna, who's the Vice President of Market Design and Analysis for the ISO, has a few words to say.
Thank you, Dr. Hobbs. Good morning, everyone. Before we begin this morning's meeting, I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge, two extraordinary members of the Market Surveillance Committee, Dr. Scott Harvey and Dr. Ben Hobbs. This is their last scheduled public meeting for both of them, so I thought it would be appropriate for us to take a moment to commemorate the great contributions they have made. You know, Scott has served on the MSC since 2011, but his contributions to the ISO go much further back, very back to the beginnings of the organization and the beginning of the MRTU, which is our market redesign that launched our LMP markets. His decades of work across every major North American market, and also his role in shaping several of the market restructurings, deep expertise in both electricity, antitrust analysis, have really positioned him and made him quite an invaluable guide to this market. And we've all benefited tremendously by his expertise. I am, and we are deeply grateful for all the clarity, rigor, and integrity that, Scott, you have provided and brought us to every discussion. Ben, Ben has been on the MSC from the very beginning, back to 2001. So, of course, he has had a tremendous impact. He's also most recently taken on the responsibility of serving as chair, which we greatly appreciate. Ben, your leadership, along with distinguished academic career and international recognition in the work that you do in energy, environmental systems, public health, has really brought to the ISO a broad breadth of depth of commitments to the public that we serve. And we really do thank you for the perspective that you have provided, which has been so largely grounded in both thoughtful, scientific research, as well as experience in the many works and engagements that you have been involved in for, I don't want to say the number, but over a quarter of a century. So thank you. Maybe more, Ben, I'm not sure. But thank you for all your contributions. You know, this market has benefited enormously from all of your expertise, your experience and wisdom. I want to, on behalf of all of us, thank you for the extraordinary work and service you have provided. I know this is work above and beyond all the other work that you all do, but I think the markets that we operate would not be the same without the contributions you have made. So from the bottom of my heart and on behalf of the ISO, I want to thank you. I personally have benefited tremendously from both of your guidance over the years, and I will miss you both very dearly. I also wanted to note that in April, we will be taking some time to celebrate and thank both Scott and Ben in our board meetings. So please join us. Those will be in-person meetings. For those of you that want to be present, we will take a moment to commemorate both of them. And finally, I also wanted to thank Dr. Bushnell for staying on and providing us the valuable continuity that we will need on the MSC. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Chair Hobbs for one last meeting, at least one last scheduled public meeting. So thank you.
Okay. Anna, that was incredibly gracious, and it is kind of scary to think about, in the words of the Grateful Dead, what a long, what the next adjective is, what a long trip it's been. And it's been terrific working with you and the staff, going all the way back to, of course, Angela Sheffrin and the crew back then. There have been several other members of the MSC besides, of course, Jim and Scott that have been great fun to work with. And I do want to have a shout out to Frank Wallach, from whom I learned so much and was inspired by his energy and his dedication to the efficiency and fairness of the California markets. So I look forward to that celebration at the end of April. That's good. That's going to be great fun. Hopefully we'll see many of you there. I could also list. There's a long list of stakeholders that we've interacted with over the years. Very very many colorful phrases. Such, there's words such as fundamentally flawed and so forth, and yet here we are. It's working, and we're going off and trying new things that will hopefully work also really well and continue to bring and expand the benefits of efficient and sustainable markets to the Western ratepayers. Let's go on, start with the meeting as usual. We'll open the mic for any public comment.
And can I speak for a second just to tell Anna I really appreciate, it's too late, but anyway, I appreciate it.
I'm here.
Being involved in the transition of the CAISO has meant a lot to me, and the formation and expansion of the WEEM is one of the great achievements, I think, in electricity in the last 20 years. I mean, the CAISO and Steve Berberich and all the people and Mark and all of you, I mean, it's a staggering achievement in my mind, one of the great ones of the last 20 years. So it's been a privilege to be on the margins of that and participate a little bit. So thank you.
Thank you, Scott, and thank you both. And I will say, to perhaps leverage Ben's comment about the trip. The trip has been long. It's been sometimes arduous, sometimes quite fun. The trip will keep going on, and I hope that we will have an opportunity to interact with both of you along that trip, because it's not over yet, but thank you.
No, we, if you remember, was it MDO2 was going to be the redesign that was going to fix the problems that emerged with the California crisis. And we, of course, learned that it does not take 2 years. In fact, market design is a process that just will continue indefinitely, because technology and public demands of the power systems will continue to evolve. So MDO2 became MDO3, MDO4, and I think at some point it was dropped. We finally got MRTU, which was a very, very exciting development. And then here we are, 16 or 17 years after that, on the brink of a West-wide day-ahead market. Anyway, there'll be a lot more time later on at the end of April to reflect some more, and I'm looking forward to that. So let's go ahead, and I will invite anybody who would like to queue up, make a public comment at this time, and any issue other than congestion revenue allocation, which we'll have plenty of time for later, or if you have a question to ask of the MSC or the staff. So operator, you can check and see whether there's anybody in the queue who would like to say something. I don't see anybody in the queue.
I see a hand from Michelle Keto.
Oh,
Operator,
this is
if you-
Michelle and then Dan.
Yes, we have 2
that's-
hands in the queue.
Okay, thanks
I
so
will
very much.
start.
Let's start with Michelle.
Okay.
R&D division. First of all, I'm very sorry that you guys are leaving. It's really been fun, talking to you in these MSC meetings over the years. And so I wish you the very best. So the 2 things that I wanted to raise. So the first one is, there's been a lot of talk about scarcity pricing, and some folks have been saying that it's a reliability issue. And I was hoping that we could reprise the discussion that we had, I think it was July of 2024, about low priority exports. So if you'll recall, one of the problems, at least with low priority exports, is that CAISO can cut those in the HASP process, but those cut low priority exports can be in base schedules. So we could actually be in sort of a deficit. And so, I think one thing is it appropriate to have scarcity pricing when the reserve margin goes down because we've cut the low priority exports, but they're actually sitting in people's base schedules. So maybe it's just more appropriate to cut the base schedule or cut the low priority exports before we go into scarcity pricing circumstances. So I sort of feel like we identified that issue 2 years ago, and I don't think we've addressed it. And if we're really concerned about reliability, there's kind of a known reliability risk with that HASP process and with low priority exports more generally. So I sort of feel like we have to deal with that first before we do the price formation. So that's just one thing I would like to key up. We did discuss it 2 years ago. I believe it was a July 2024 Market Surveillance Committee meeting. So that's one thing. The second thing that I wanted to bring up is I was wondering if it made sense to discuss the results of parallel operations, or at least very close after the go live. For example, I've been saying, I guess a lot of people have been saying that the requirement is too high. So in parallel operations on 3/3, hour ending 17, the up requirement was 4,428 megawatts. The down requirement was 5,651 megawatts. So that's essentially reserve requirements of 10,000 megawatts. The load forecast for that day was 22,000. So that's 50%. So I would just note that it's a big requirement, and that's one issue. The other issue, this I'd like to discuss, and maybe if you guys have an answer to me, what's going to happen now is virtual supply is, you want to converge the market, but virtual supply, if they show up in the IFM, CAISO is going to have to backfill that in the RCU with RCU. So let's say 5,000 megawatts of virtuals get taken in the IFM. CAISO has to replace the 5,000 megawatts with RCU in the RUC process. But right now that price is 0. So you might have folks showing up to try to converge the markets. But if RCU has a price attached to it, let's say it's $55 or even $20, first of all, it's unknowable because who knows how much virtuals are showing up. And secondly, who knows how much bid in demand you got, because you also have to clear bid in demand in the RUC process. So if it clears it some amount of money, the virtual supply has to overcome whatever payment that is, right? So if you get a IFM payment of $55, the virtual payment is $25, that has to be better than the real-time payment. So I'm just wondering if anyone has thought about what's going to happen with virtuals, given that RCU is now going to be a cleared market. I guess that's a question. Has anyone thought about that?
Okay. So there are 3 things that you raised. First, about a general question of whether it's appropriate to have scarcity pricing after you've cut low priority export. Cutting of low priority exports trigger scarcity pricing, HASP process, and then in the HASP process. And then second, you asked about a particular parallel operations result on March 3rd.
Right. So I guess the first question is, can we talk about that HASP process at a future meeting and its interaction with scarcity pricing? So that's not a question I'm necessarily asking you guys to answer today. The second one, I'm also not, what I was hoping, but I guess you guys are leaving, is that we could have a meeting about the results of parallel operations, because we set up this whole system and, it would be kind of great to discuss it before it goes live. And, as I see it, these requirements are really large on a day that's not very difficult, right? So that's having implications for the market, and it potentially has efficiency implications. And it seems like it would be better to talk about it before it goes live than after it goes live and you're trying to fix it. And then there are two issues that I'm seeing in parallel ops. One, that those requirements are really high. And then the second issue is the operation of virtuals. And I just feel like people should think about what it means to clear RC at the cleared price when the virtuals are going to have to pay that. And I'm just wondering if anyone thought about that and the implication for the efficiency of the market if virtuals can't estimate what the RC prices are going to be.
Yeah. So just before we get to the third one, I wanted to ask anybody from CAISO who can comment on it. I'm not aware, just because I don't follow all the other meetings, but is there some kind of regular market participant update on the parallel ops, or is there a plan to have a non-MSC meeting that would talk about the results of parallel ops sometime this month?
Well, I can say, oh, go ahead.
Hi, Jimmy, this is Guillermo. Yeah, I can elaborate on that. What we have done, and we are starting to be more deliberate, is to start using the weekly market operations meeting that is set up. The original intent of that meeting was mostly about the process, the logistics, the data, but we're starting to bring more of the analytics and the discussion of the market results. So I would see that weekly meeting to be leveraged to have more explicit discussion on the market results and the dynamics that we are seeing in parallel operations. My suggestion would be to start using that more effectively to discuss the results and expand it to the original intent that we have for that meeting.
Mm-hmm. And a follow-up question for you, Guillermo. Our last MSC meeting, you mentioned sort of transition arrangements for EDAM that would adjust some of the requirements and things, at least during a transition period. Are the parallel ops exploring those at all, or are the parallel ops imposing basically the kind of non-transition levels of parameters and requirements?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jim. Let me elaborate what the plan is. And this is a plan that we have elaborated in the last week, last working session of the configurable parameters. As of now, we have started with the original values that we indicated for parallel operations, effective yesterday run for trading day today. We have adjusted the values down for two parameters, which is the multiplier for the envelope constraints and the deployable factor. We continue to use a light enforcement of transmission constraints. What we have indicated, and we are asking for participant feedback, and this is a discussion we have last week, about expanding that potential provisions to also consider the imbalance reserve requirements that is on the table. And we expect to get all the feedback from participants about this approach by end of last week. The expectation is that once we get the feedback, we can make an adjustment to the parallel operation setup so that we can see as much as possible before going live with a potential setup that we want to go live with. And that will give us at least 3 weeks of parallel operations results with the transitional approach that we want to go for the day one of EDAM.
Yeah,
that decision.
I think it's really valuable to have sort of the rules you're going to have on day one kind of in there, but at the same time, it's an opportunity to explore the implications of the original sort of set of numbers too. But I think you're probably doing it
But can I just make a point though?
Yeah.
I mean, I get this and I'm participating in those and I appreciate it, but we have noted that imports and batteries aren't showing up. So whatever testing we're doing right now is not yet valid if you're missing 4,000 megawatts of imports and 4,000 megawatts of batteries. And so my concern is the testing isn't valid.
Fair enough. Yeah, I was just trying to understand where, because I think that logistically there won't be a public MSC meeting able to do this. I'm sure I would expect there would be one shortly after go live. But I just kind of trying to understand what other forums are trying to go over this. And I think it is valuable to have MSC reactions. I will probably have some opportunity to have some at least interactions with CAISO on this.
Has anyone thought about the virtuals?
Yeah, I mean, they are gonna get this charge that they won't know in advance like they do today. I mean, today they get allocated uplift they don't know. And it may be, I mean,
Yeah.
it would have been better to have the joint design where it all would have cleared and they would have cleared at a lower price. But, a decision was made back, like almost, 8 years ago or something to not do that and to split out RUC separately. And there were reasonable reasons for that.
Yeah.
Related to some of your concerns about, some of these other, level imbalance reserves and the level of RUC commitments and so forth. So that's where we are. It might be more elegant in some ways, and I think it would be more elegant in some ways to clear them jointly, and then the virtuals would just clear at a lower price, and they'd be clear based on their bids, so they wouldn't have to guess. But there are other considerations. So we are where we are, and it's not completely different from the risk they have today about variations in uplift. But we'll have to see how big the variations in cost are, and maybe that'll lead to changes.
Right now, all RA resources have a $0 requirement in RUC, and also have to return that capacity payment. So basically, RUC costs are zero. I mean, effectively, they're so low. So virtuals don't have to take that into consideration. And if you've been following parallel operations, it's been clearing at the day ahead bid, the default bid, which is $55. Now, we don't think that's going to happen in real time, at least hopefully not. But the reason is because you don't have those batteries and the imports in there. So virtuals are clearing, and then they have to put the virtuals in the RC process. So I'm just saying that, hopefully that's not what's going to happen, but these are very non-zero prices. And so those very non-zero prices are going to get allocated to virtual generation. And then, and then it's going to be so uncertain, that they might not participate, and they have to overcome that price to, converge the day ahead market and the real time market. So I'm just wondering whether we're going to have big separation and how one would get rid of that, right? So, and also since we're clearing 10,000 megawatts of IR, you've taken a lot out of the energy market, so you're potentially having a higher price in the day ahead market, which you can't converge. So anyway, I just was hoping somebody had thought through these things.
Just to clarify one thing, Michelle. Remember today that they don't get paid for the capacity RA units bids in RUC, but all the commitment cost, all that uplift gets allocated to virtual supply. So if you go through the DMM reports, you'll see there's a non-trivial allocation of cost to virtual supply, which they have to figure in today.
Absolutely, BCR. And that was another issue that I am concerned about as well. When you're potentially committing a lot of, it depends on whether we're going to get thermal units, but when you're committing that much additional capacity to provide that up and down, BCR is potentially going to be larger. And we asked people about that, but they're not looking at it, or at least we haven't seen it. So that's another concern.
None of us are really that involved in parallel ops and don't see what's happening. So, we can't make
But
detailed.
that's why it would be great to bring it to you so you guys could look and think about it, but maybe that's not going to happen. So that was my wish.
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Let me ask my colleagues. So if if the cost of participating in virtual supply is higher and more uncertain, and we just get less virtual supply or higher priced virtual supply, less virtual supply clearing, then that does have a feedback of lowering the amount of RUC that gets acquired, doesn't it? And so do we then equilibrate sort of just at a lower amount of RUC and a lower amount of virtual supply? I guess it will depend upon how demand participates. If there's a lot, if demand is not supplying their full, or if we're not clearing the day ahead demand at the forecast, then we're still going to need a lot of RUC. But and it'll just clear at high energy prices, I guess. But I would think there would be some feedback if demand is close to its anticipated forecast, that you just clear at sort of a lower amount of both.
Yeah, I mean, if virtual supply gets a lower return, they're going to submit a higher bid and less of it'll clear. And to the extent that is a true cost that we're incurring to cover for the virtual supply, then that's not necessarily a bad thing. But it gets complicated because we have, virtual supply and offsetting virtual demand, and the allocation is a little more root than that, which is one of the advantages of the original design. It was a little more elegant and dealt with some of those issues better, but there were downsides of that too. So.
Sorry, somebody's saying something?
Yeah.
Oh, I was just saying thank you.
Oh, okay. I wanted to
Good
ask
question.
about Michelle's second point. So there's the
large IRU.
So up and down about 5 gigawatts worth. It was 22 plus or minus roughly 5. So is that magnitude of reserves consistent with the magnitude of uncertainty? I forget, it was 95% or 97.5%, whatever it is, that the data reflects. And so these are not unexpected numbers and magnitudes for RS? Or was that March 3rd somehow seemingly extraordinary, much larger than what we tend to see for estimates of uncertainty in other days? And maybe this is, asking about a particular day, this is not a great forum for doing that, but and if nobody has the numbers at their fingertips, if nobody has a sense of how big the uncertainty is, the net load uncertainty that RS is being procured for, then that'll be a good thing to discuss when there's an opportunity to.
I mean, it's a good question. Why was it that big? And
or maybe that isn't big. Maybe that is the magnitude.
No, I mean, it might have been it'd be good to unpack exactly what it says for the uncertainty forecasting approaches.
Given that a lot of that, that's net load. There's an awful lot of behind the meter production, so that a load of 22 gigawatts could conceivably have a lot of uncertainty associated with it.
Yeah, there's like VERS sort of in that.
Okay.
And Ben, Jim, just a comment before we move on. I think part of this is an expectation, right? We have the requirements calculated under certain methodology that obviously is based on historical information. That historical information is really the measurements of what the historical errors have been. So it's not right to go crazy beyond the ranges that we have defined. We have some threshold to ensure that it doesn't go extremely high when you have some issues with the convergence of the quantile approach. But I would be cautious to just anchor the perception that is too high, too low, purely based on the demand level. because the uncertainty is not based just on the demand level. It is composed of the demand, the wind, and the solar variation. Whether it's a 22,500 day or a 45,000 K day, it doesn't really do the justice to capture the uncertainty that happens on the solar, on the wind, and that is a seasonal condition. The requirement that we have is a methodology that is dynamic enough to capture the seasonal conditions and the time of the day. So it is predicated on the historical performance, and if historical errors have been of that magnitude, you would expect to see the requirements to be in that range. I think everything boils down to one question. Is the 97.5 percentile and the 2.5 percentile the standard risk that is appropriate to procure through a market mechanism? And keep in mind, there is also the other factor, that this is a requirement, but we provide this economically through the market. There is a demand curve that is going to temper the procurement based on the economics of the system.
Right, right. So that was the point I was trying to make about the 22, is that it's a net load. There are several components to it, and the errors can add up to something that's quite significant. And it's an empirical matter how large of the errors been in the past. And so I was just asking, is that indeed the case that the analysis does show that you do get 5 gigawatt errors, whether it's a low net load day or a high net load day, that's certainly possible. Okay, and then there was finally Michelle's first question about scarcity process and cutting of the cutting of low priority exports. Will that wind up being discussed? I don't know what the answer is to that question, whether that is something that's going to come back in the discussion of price formation in the future. But it sounds like that at least Michelle and no doubt other stakeholders would like to see that discussed again. Anybody in staff want to say anything about whether that's an issue that's likely to come up in future discussions of price formation?
Well, we will be discussing price formation, and so I think it's a legitimate, and the interaction between price formation, scarcity pricing, and I think the import-export incentives are definitely sort of worth talking through. But I get the sense there's a desire to get through EDAM, go live, and see where we are before we get back to that.
Find out what's actually important, and to talk about what's because there are lots of things that could be talked about, but may not all of them may actually be significant. So thank you, Michelle, for those comments. I don't see anybody else queued up. Dan Williams was. But,
we chased him away with a long discussion, I guess.
Yeah, sorry if we scared you away, Dan, if you couldn't stick around for that, but look forward to hearing from you later. Okay, so that clears the queue. So we can now go to the main agenda item here. So I'll just first take a moment to remind folks that last June, the MSC adopted opinion at a public meeting on the question of congestion revenue allocation in EDAM, and in particular the management of congestion revenues, who pays, who gets them, arising from parallel flows in BAAs that arise from schedules that originate and sync in other BAAs. And we discussed 3 variants of the ISO's proposal for addressing the issue in that. And so what was the issue? The original FERC approved EDAM design would have had the BAA where the congested network element was located, that BAA would retain the congestion revenue from the flow times the shadow price, no matter which EDAM BAAs were the locations of the sources and sinks of those schedules. And so there'll be congestion costs collected under such a system from market parties for schedules sourced and synced to one set of BAAs, while other BAAs, where the resulting parallel flows occur and have caused congestion, will be paid for that congestion under that initial design. So in the absence of a congestion revenue right mechanism that would redistribute that revenue somehow among BAAs in a way that would allow market parties to secure rights to those revenues so they can hedge the congestion charges they pay for the net injections, the result would, there'd be two results that were of concern. One will be a redistribution of congestion revenues among BAAs compared to the distribution today. And second, the other concern was a potential inability for BAAs who have distributed firm transmission rights under the open transmission tariff, network integration transmission service rules. They may have an inability to cover all the congestion costs associated with those rights. The result is there was a perceived conflict between two of the fundamental objectives of the EDAM design, which were to provide congestion revenues to BAAs where congestion and its costs occur, while at the same time allowing BAAs to retain their systems of OAT firms transmission rights that help them recover fixed network costs and provide hedges against transmission congestion costs to their market participants. I'm certainly not going to summarize the opinion here, but and actually thanks to Milos, who will summarize some of the points from that in his presentation. But I will recommend that we did recommend the exploration of a negotiated entitlement approach to congestion revenue allocation. And Milos is going to talk about that some more. So 9 months later, here we are on the brink of EDAM Go Live. We're here today to further discuss proposals for managing these congestion revenues and the results of analyses led by Guillermo and done by his crew of the magnitude and occurrence of possible congestion revenue shifts. We have 3 presentations today, as I mentioned. Milos is going to kick things off by summarizing some issues in the EDAM congestion revenue allocation. Thank you, Milos. And he's going to discuss several issues in particular raised by our proposal for the negotiated entitlement approach. Looking at historical Western energy imbalance market performance and flows and congestion prices, what can be inferred about the magnitude of congestion costs, occurrence and shifts. And so that'll be very interesting. And finally, Scott Harvey from the MSC has a couple presentations to talk about issues in his view of what can be learned from these analyses and what questions remain unanswered. So I'll go ahead and invite Milos to the podium, and looking forward to your presentation. Thank you for preparing this.
Thank you, Ben, and good morning, MSC members. Thank you for the opportunity to brief you on phase 2 of the EDAM Congestion Revenue Allocation Initiative. As you noted, we had a phase 1 last year that we've gone through the process, and FERC approved that design as a starting EDAM design. And but through that process, we committed to recognize as a transitional design and committed to launching phase 2 of the initiative to look at either additional enhancements and a longer term, more durable design. And so I'll provide an update on where we are with the phase 2 activities, and especially as we start moving into the more substantive consideration of different design alternatives. We would certainly appreciate some of your wisdom and your insights into some of those considerations, including I'll raise some questions I think that would be helpful to get your insights on the alternative that you recommended for the negotiated entitlements approach. So this will be a little bit of an initial kickoff to brief you on where we are with phase 2 and then tee up some questions for you. And I know that your presentation at the end will likely also address that and more. So really appreciate your time today. If we can go to the next slide, please. just as a little bit of addition to what you noted, Ben, an overview of the current design that's at least slated for launch with EDAM. In phase one of the initiative, the one that we held last year, the ISO and stakeholders, we evaluated a design for that parallel flow congestion revenue allocation, and then subsequently FERC approved that design, phase one design, in August of last year, supporting that launch in May of EDAM. The phase one design was seen as transitional design and a temporary design subject to our continued discussions with stakeholders. But that phase one design effectively established an approach under which congestion revenues that result from internal constraints are allocated to the balancing area where that constraint is located. And then, as you noted, the parallel flow congestion revenues that's associated with the exercise of eligible firm out transmission rights that are exercised through a balanced self-schedule. Those congestion revenues are allocated to the balancing area where the transmission rights are being exercised. And the idea there was to allocate sufficient congestion revenues to those balancing areas so that they can provide a more complete congestion hedge for customers that are exercising those transmission rights as they transition into markets, that they're not exposed to congestion price differences once they exercise those transmission rights. Under all of these designs, the market operator is the one that's collecting the congestion revenues and then is allocating those congestion revenues among the EDAM balancing areas. And then the EDAM balancing areas, through their own tariffs, ultimately create the rules for the sub-allocation amongst its transmission customers. If we go to the next slide, please. So as I noted, we recognize that this phase one design was temporary. It had certain issues that needed to be remedied that we recognized throughout the policy process, but it was seen as a compromise and as a reasonable launching point for the EDAM go-live, subject to some of the monitoring and some of the data analysis that Guillermo will touch on later. But it was considered as a transitional design that we committed to the board to evaluate additional enhancements in a longer-term, more durable design as we consider EDAM and as additional entities join EDAM in the coming years. So the key issues that we noted, particularly we recognized in phase one of the design that needed to be considered when we're looking at additional enhancements in this phase two of the initiative. And these are by no means the only issues, but these are, I think, the two critical aspects from phase one that we noted needed to be considered and remedied in phase two as part of a longer-term design. One is eliminating or finding ways of further reducing the self-schedule incentives that the phase one design may create, and creating a design that supports robust economic bidding, that provides those economic benefits by encouraging economic bidding of resources in the EDAM. And it's not tied squarely to the congestion, to the manner and mechanism in which congestion revenue is allocated. The second element was also finding opportunities to create further symmetry in allocation of those parallel flow congestion revenues for the CAISO balancing area that may result from that transitional phase one design. And this was particularly related to the recognition that there's differences in this EDAM world. In the CAISO balancing area, we have the congestion revenue rights mechanism for allocation of congestion revenues and providing a mechanism for hedging. And it's a little bit different than the design that may exist in other balancing areas who operate under an open access transmission tariff, where there's explicit reservation of transmission rights in advance. And that first design created a bit of an asymmetry between the CAISO and those balancing areas that we said we're going to look to remedy and address in phase two of this initiative. And again, by all means, this is not a complete list, but these are the two key issues that we noted we'll particularly be paying attention to in the next phase of the design. If we go to the next slide, please. So I want to provide a little bit of a status update and progress update of where we are in terms of this phase two of the initiative on EDAM congestion revenue allocation. We've initiated the stakeholder working groups. We've had 2 sessions thus far. We started in December of last year, and then we had a session here in the later part of February. And the key focus of those stakeholder working groups, or those initial 2 stakeholder working groups, was one, the data analysis that we committed to performing as part of the phase one design, and we committed that to the board. Guillermo in those working groups shared progress on his data analysis, looking at EIM data and what that showed in regards to the congestion effects between different constraints in the CAISO and PacifiCorp. And today provides an opportunity to, I think, put some more quantification on that analysis. I think today will be the first time that we kind of publicly share that quantification in terms of the dollar amounts of potential effects and the range of effects. But that's one area that we focused in those working groups. And then the second area that we focused on was establishing principles to guide design consideration in this next phase when we look at either enhancements or a longer term design, more durable design to congestion revenue allocation. With the last stakeholder working group in February, I think we developed a large consensus on the design principles. And so we've indicated that the next stage of working groups that will be slated for March through May, we really want to focus those next set of working groups on the evaluation and consideration of different design concepts for congestion revenue allocation that are consistent with the principles, but also address some of the issues that we noted needed to be addressed in phase one and that provide for that more durable design to congestion revenue allocation. And that's where we thought it would be good to take this opportunity today to get your perspectives as we prepare to embark on this next phase, looking at those more substantive discussions on design alternatives, design considerations, and concepts. It will be great to get your inputs and insights into what are some of those considerations, what are your ideas and concepts of what we should be considering in that next phase, but particularly regarding the alternative that I think you introduced in your phase one opinion on negotiated entitlements, a negotiated entitlements framework. So if we go to the next slide. Certainly one of the concepts that we will consider in this next stage of stakeholder working groups will be a negotiated entitlement approach consistent with your recommendations, some of your insights and descriptions in that opinion. But we wanted to also take an opportunity today to get some maybe additional perspectives from you as to how that negotiated entitlement concept could work, or how it could be actuated or effectuated to help us think through that approach in the stakeholder upcoming discussions. I wanted to frame a few questions, and again, you can address them here, or I think some of them also by default be addressed later on in your presentation, but just wanted to tease out a couple of different questions regarding the negotiated entitlement approach that I think can help the ISO and stakeholders think through how viable and how concrete this approach is and how it could be effectuated in the context of EDAM. One of those questions is, under a negotiated entitlement approach, who would be the parties that are negotiating that entitlement, those entitlements, recognizing the unique structure of the EDAM. If you keep in mind, the EDAM structure is you have different balancing areas participating in a common market. You have different transmission providers within those balancing areas that are participating as well. And then you have transmission customers that hold transmission rights procured under those open access transmission tariffs. So who would be the parties, as you envision, that would be on that negotiating table and thinking through some of those elements of a negotiated entitlement approach? This may be a little bit different than some of the experience in the Eastern interconnection, where you have maybe two market operators and two markets under a common tariff that may be looking at negotiating certain entitlements associated with congestion and congestion revenue allocation. So that's one question, is how messy or how clean can this get in terms of who are the parties on the negotiating table when thinking of negotiated entitlements?
Milos,
the next question, yeah, go ahead.
We could talk about more of this later, but I think this question is good for me to make a couple comments here. I mean, there are two levels. I mean, in the East, you had, yes, negotiations between market operators, between PJM and MISO on flow entitlements, for example, and New York and PJM. But in addition, you had negotiations in defining the entitlements and FTR entitlements, informing the MISO, informing SPP, informing the NISO. And there were agreements at that level, which involves the transmission owners that sold the firm transmission service, some of which was not supported by the transmission system, but supported by their generation. And there were negotiations to some of that transmission service was not really feasible, and the firm's sales were not really feasible in the transmission system, and had to into so there were negotiations in MISO and SPP and New York on those reconciling the allocation of FTRs with the existing firm service. There were also tariff filings at FERC to amend the terms of some of the Oak transmission service to be consistent with the operation of the ISO. And one of the elements there was that the operation of the electricity market increased the value of some of that OAT service, and therefore FERC allowed changes to be made to it. The governing body market expert, Dr. Pope, and I both testified in the NISO proceeding on behalf of the NISO and the transmission owners on the amendment to some of those OAT contracts. So, this is something that may have to happen. So it's partly negotiation, and if the negotiation doesn't work, it's filing at FERC. But there are two aspects. It's not just negotiations within the MISO and PJM. There's also a negotiation between, the transmission owners, balancing areas, and transmission service customers within MISO, within NISO. And there were agreements in the formation of those ISOs. And here we're, informing EDAM and creating a day-ahead market, and we may need to have some explicit agreements on those historic entitlements. I point out as an example that in MISO, some transmission providers were allocated counterflow FDRs to reflect the fact that they had sold transmission service, which was supported by the operation of their generation and wasn't actually feasible. And there, it wasn't in the form of flow entitlements at the level of the balancing areas and the transmission customers. It was transmission rights. But as I'll talk about more, FTRs and flow entitlements all flow together. They're all consistent. So we can, when we get in negotiations or working out agreements, you can talk about all of those things. So that's just some brief comments on that first point while it's in everybody's mind. So I'll pass the baton back, the mic back to you, Milos.
No, thank you, Scott. That's very helpful. Those are great insights. It sounds like even though, there was a negotiation between market operators in the Eastern interconnection context, there was still a role for individual transmission owners, transmission providers, balancing areas, and even transmission customers in ultimately thinking through that negotiated entitlement approach. And as you said, it led to tariff modifications potentially in certain instances as well in those areas.
Right.
Very helpful. Thank you. The next question that comes to mind is, as you know, the West is a little bit differently situated maybe than the East, in that you have so many individual and independent balancing areas that over the years have probably established different negotiated agreements or operational arrangements to manage loop flow between them. And I'm curious your thoughts on to what extent does this kind of a negotiated entitlement approach, as you've suggested, to what extent does that affect, undermine, or does it, or needs for those agreements to come to the table as well and potentially be affected by a negotiated entitlement approach for congestion revenue allocation? Do you see any relationship between those, and is there any risk that what we come up with the negotiated entitlement approach will impact potential arrangements that parties may have in place today between individual balancing areas or transmission providers to manage some of those effects or risks, or not to manage them if there are no agreements? But curious your insights in that relationship between existing arrangements that may be in place under this negotiated entitlement approach to congestion revenue allocation.
Right. Good point, Milos. Because those negotiations are going to involve the transmission system operators and the transmission system owners and the balancing areas. You know, they'd be the entities and parties to most of these agreements, so they could take those into account in reaching agreements on flow entitlements and other types of transmission entitlements. With the formation of the WEAM and its redispatch across the West, we have to recognize that a lot of things that had to be managed by agreements today are just managed by the CAISO running a security constrained dispatch every 5 minutes, and it alleviates the needs for some of those agreements. But we're still going to need agreements between market operators in the West, and existing agreements, you know, will need to be reflected in those, and that was certainly the case in the East as well. There were pre-existing agreements regarding the operation of the Ontario powers, the 5018 power between New York and PJM, and all the other powers. And in the joint congestion management negotiations and agreements, they refined those provisions and eliminated sources of contention in the old agreements, or reasons that the old agreements had pretty much ceased to be effective and become a major problem. So I think, you know, what happened in the East, there might be a glorified version that everything was cozy-dozy and working fine, but in reality, you know, the joint congestion management agreements were making up for some of the problems in what existed, for example, between New York and PJM, and agreements on managing flows with the powers. And of course, with the expansion of PJM and the expansion of MISO, the old TLR framework was just completely broken. You know, FERC and NERC, you know, conditioned the expansion of PJM and FERC and MISO on dealing with those fundamental changes to the effectiveness of TLR, so that even, you know, there was even in regions which didn't have full joint congestion management, there were changes to the way TLRs were and flows were calculated and TLRs applied. So I think, yes, you have to take account of all the existing agreements, and also understand which existing agreements are broken, which existing agreements are working well, and which existing agreements are good, but actually they're redundant because we've solved the problem with the redispatch, and now we just have to focus on cost allocation.
Yeah. Can I ask? So, in my mind, the two bullets, your last two bullets, are closely related. Like, existing agreements reflect sort of a crude negotiated approach to trying to manage this kind of externality that different BAs are imposing on each other, and that can serve as a basis for kind of an alternative way of sharing the costs of those. But I guess, can you elaborate a little bit more on what kinds of negotiated operational agreements are out there? And is this more or less different BAs agreeing not to do too much to their neighbors? And how is that operationalized? Can you just flesh that out a little bit more?
Yeah, I'll try as much as I can. This is mainly anecdotal, hearing kind of secondhand from different stakeholders that there are arrangements. You know, one way that parties manage some of the loop flow effects is through their ATC methodologies. There are certain margins that they introduce for maybe not selling as much across a particular path or flow gate, recognizing that there's a potential for loop flow. That varies by transmission provider. That probably varies by the facility as well. That's informed probably by historical flows. That could also be informed by certain arrangements between transmission providers, to the extent that they run into issues and may have established agreements on how to manage certain effects to the extent that flows exceed, in contribution by loop flow, exceed certain limits. But we've heard anecdotally that there are arrangements, particularly associated with individual facilities across the West, between transmission providers largely. I think less BA to BA, but transmission providers where the transmission facilities interconnect and how they manage loop flows and under certain grid conditions We've also heard that a number of these are, in the West, it's not necessarily managed by an agreement, but these are kind of, what's the right term? I think we've heard bury your own debt or something to that effect, where there's not an agreement, there's an acknowledgement of loop flows, and you just manage the conditions as they materialize. And even in those instances, I think this negotiated entitlement approach, I guess I'm trying to get a sense of, it can impact agreements, but it can also force certain things that maybe have been buried by parties willingly or unwillingly in terms of the effects of loop flows on each other's systems. But it sounds like that in a negotiated entitlement approach, especially if you're going to be looking at different bases for establishing that entitlement across a particular constraint, it may force bringing people to the table where they may not have come to the table before, or it may force changes either to ATC methodologies or individual agreements that parties may have established to manage that. I don't know if that answers it, but again, I think there's different ways that parties manage that today, including by not managing it, and this may force it to now come to the forefront and figuring a way of how to account for those loop flows.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like it's it could certainly make these costs more transparent, and the economic view of that is that that's not a bad thing, but there's also, it can be awkward, I guess, in some for some people in some circumstances too. Okay, and so if you are limiting the ATC on, and this could even be on an internal path, possibly, that if you sell too much on an internal path, you just sort of recognize that that is imposing a lot of parallel flow. That's sort of something that may be a nature of an arrangement. I mean, I think that is the kind of thing that could be used as a basis for, trying to map historical mutually acceptable practices onto something that's a negotiated sort of financial equivalent of that. To the extent they're taking actual sort of physical actions to really change the dispatch, one would hope that this could that again, establishing sort of a financial equivalent could basically give them more options for managing that could find a more efficient solution. To the extent it's just sort of kind of trying to manage it internally and hoping that it all kind of washes out between everybody. I guess we'll find out, but that if it's true, then it should be relatively easy to find, that would make it easier to find a negotiated solution. If it's not true, then we'll have to sort of confront that fact.
Yeah, no, and that's a great point. I think you framed it well. I think what I was getting after this question was really, there is an awkwardness that can come out of this between transmission providers, depending on the history. The other element is, I think in my mind, is the timeliness effect as well. To the extent the parties do have to look at some of the historical data and potentially negotiate or change some of their other practices, there's a time component as well to that. And as the EDAM footprint grows, I can see this taking a bit more time between transmission providers and ultimately finding a way into the market as well. But thank you for those insights. Really appreciate it.
And I'll just say, I mean, I think that the costs and magnitudes of parallel flows are going to become more transparent no matter what. For at least for all the members of EDAM, because it's just part of operating the market, and that's part of sort of what we're trying to get our heads around is sort of what those magnitudes are. So it's not like even in the absence of negotiated solution, I think we'll know a lot more no matter what. I actually wanted to make a comment on, you had a slide a couple slides ago talking about, the two goals. One is to sort of encourage economic bidding and discourage self-scheduling, and that's one of the concerns with the current approach. I just wanted to sort of flesh out also that there's economic bidding, and then there's economic bidding that's driven by the incentives provided by congestion revenue. And so just getting them to bid is not necessarily the goal here. The goal is to get them to bid sort of reflective of their actual operating costs, not bid sort of strategically to try to manage maximize or minimize the congestion costs that they might face. And so just going from self-scheduling to any kind of bidding is not necessarily the goal here.
Yeah, no, great point. Great point, Jim. And then I don't know if we still have time for just a last question I kind of frame here to get your insights. And some of this is in your opinion, but curious with the broader stakeholders here as well, if kind of share your parting thoughts on this, for lack of a better term, but on the basis for establishing those entitlements through negotiations associated with specific constraints. I think you've mentioned potentially historical flows, looking at historical flows and limits, maybe pursuing it from a dollar allocation limit per constraint. Just curious if you have any more insights on that you can leave us and stakeholders with as we embark on evaluating this approach. The effectiveness of different approaches, anything that you think is better than a different aspect of information and data to look at to inform establishing those and negotiated limits? Do you see it as a mix and match of different particular constraints depending on the availability of historical information and other data? Curious your parting thoughts kind of on what are the different data sets that we can look at to inform those limits.
Well, Scott's view is that I think the historical flows are an important piece of information. You mentioned historical agreements, and to the extent there are historical agreements that provide that facilities will be operated in a particular way, or other agreements on managing flows, those are certainly relevant in terms of establishing existing entitlements. And because we've been operating the Western EIM now for quite a few years, we have a lot of information about base schedules in particular, and what people put in for their base schedules, and those were supported by they needed to have base schedules to meet the resource sufficiency evaluation, and they were either paying for transmission service or using network service, or they had to buy transmission service or imports. So I think all of that is relevant in terms of historic information. And there is a view here and a choice. Some people think that the flow entitlement should evolve as your generating mix and your load should change, that you should get a different entitlement. I'm not so favorable to that, because siting generation is not, is a choice. And if you cite generation where it causes a lot of flows over a neighbor, and you don't have to bear those because you get flow entitlements, you don't really see the full cost of your siting decision. And as I will talk about a little bit more later, one of the things we have in mind is that it would be good to have a sense of flow entitlements, that here's what we're entitled to now, here's history, and if we deviate from that, you're using more of people's transmission system that is already constrained, keeping in mind that if it's not constrained, you don't pay anything for those flows. But if you create more flows, you pay the shadow price of that constraint above your historic use. Or you can build more transmission if you'd rather build transmission than pay the cost of displacing other people's use of their system. So I think that's kind of fair and equitable, and provides going forward investment incentives, that you bear the cost of the new facility, the new load. If you site a bunch of data centers where they're going to create a lot of flows over your neighbor, shouldn't you bear some of the cost? And it shouldn't just be, I get now that I cited those in a place where they're going to create a lot of flows over someone else's system, I get more flow entitlements. I mean, I think that's great for the person doing it, but it doesn't create the right incentives for locating facilities, and creates cost shifts.
Yeah. So I do a lot of work in emissions markets, and I tend to think about these kind of congestion externalities in a sort of similar light. And there's a kind of parallel debate or set of issues that have emerged when you establish like a cap and trade market, where you start pricing an externality that previously hadn't been paid for. So, for example, if you're imposing loop flow on a neighboring balancing authority and you hadn't necessarily had to pay for it under traditional kind of informal scheduling, is how much should history be the guide towards how much you could continue to use, going forward versus some other metric of fairness or equity or whatever. And the parallel in cap and trade markets is, so if I had been traditionally putting out a certain amount of emissions from my normal business's practices when under previous regimes, should I be allowed an allocation of some of the allowances to cover those historical emissions? Or should, I have to pay for all externalities that even, to the level that I'd historically been able to do? And, normal in most markets, cap and trade markets, the sort of to smooth these transitions, there's been an allocation of some kind of historic baseline of emissions. Usually it's ideally exogenous to any of their going forward decisions. So it smooths the economic kind of dollar, impact of starting to price those externalities, but it preserves the efficient incentives to try to manage those externalities when it's cost effective to do so. And so that's kind of the parallel here that Scott's, if we give them an exogenous allocation to historical flows, but not continue to update that based upon additional loop flows they might be imposing on other neighbors, then they have an incentive to try to manage that. And they could always, maybe pay for more, but they have to sort of view the trade-offs rather than just trying to think of the loop flows imposed as being costless going forward. But I'm sure there'll be some who say the historical flows, were unfair, and so maybe they shouldn't. Maybe there should be a different metric. But it seems like starting with historical practices, especially if they're reflected in some kind of negotiated settlement, is a natural starting point.
Yeah, I agree, Jim. There may be need for adjusting. Some of the historical flows might have been inequitable and not really appropriate, but so. There may be room for negotiating away from that, but I think it's a useful starting point. And keeping it, as you said, fixed and exogenous and not have it change over time based on where people build their plants and site new loads.
No, thank you. This was very helpful. Really appreciate it. And I think that guidance will serve us well as we go into the next stage of looking at this alternative in more depth along with others. So really appreciate your insights and look forward to your presentation here towards the end of the day. And just personally just want to extend again my appreciation for all of your work over these last few years in particular that I've worked with you on wheel-throughs, EDAM, congestion revenue allocation. Thank you for all the time you spent and all your insights, and we wish you all the best in your next endeavors. Thank you again. I'll switch. I think Guillermo will go next for his presentation whenever you're ready.
Should we stop and ask the people on the phone?
Let's see if there's any questions. Yeah.
I can't really see the queue in the new format on the.
Okay, Dan Williams.
Dan has a question.
Re-entered the queue. Dan?
It's from the Energy Authority. So I guess circling back when I raised my hand, when Michelle was asking some very good questions, it was kind of just responding to the fact of you guys leaving and just reflecting back on the fact that it was, I think, 2012 or 2013 when I first dialed into an MSC meeting and listened to, I think, Scott and Mark Holman going at each other over some obscure point of market design back then. And I can't believe it's been 14 years that been learning from you guys, and just very much appreciate all the time you've put into it, and especially all the written opinions that are there on the CAISO site to go and look through as we tackle issues that maybe we've looked at in the past, but forgot that we talked about years ago. Just an incredible record of information out there that I'm sure took hundreds of hours of your time to put together over the years, if not thousands. But anyway, to the point here on what we're dealing with, the question I had is just that that I really appreciate all that discussion of the entitlements, but it feels to me like there's this gap between now and some future point where that discussion becomes the right discussion to have. And what I'm thinking of is just that we have a footprint solidifying for EDAM. We have a footprint solidifying for SPP's Markets Plus and for the SPP's RTO expansion. And each of those footprints are going to be connected by contract path transmission from transmission providers predominantly over the next few years. And also the EDAM sort of sub footprints of the EDAM BAs are connected by contract path transmission for the foreseeable future. And so I just wanted to sort of put the question out there of how do you sort of think about the West dealing with this kind of transition point between all these transmission rights having been awarded by under a contract path paradigm, the need to still use that contract path paradigm to effectuate transfers between regions and in some instances even between markets, and then at what point does it make sense to think about transitioning to more of a flow-based entitlement system? Like, do we have to wait until all the day-ahead markets have fully subsumed all market activity in the West before we can do that? Or is there utility in trying to do that within, say, within the just the EDAM footprint, but not between the markets? So just wonder if that brings up any thoughts for you.
Well, I mean, Scott, from my view, when I started talking about flow entitlements back a year ago, my thought was that those could be applied even just between Pacific Corp and the CAISO in terms of defining their flow entitlements for EDAM settlements of their transmission service. And it doesn't have to involve anybody else. But the more people you bring into it and the more that, but it might have to take account of all the other, the use of by everybody else, but you can have PAC Corp and CAISO agree on their entitlements. Now, if somebody wants, if other people want entitlements that are so large they cut into that, then when those people join, eventually you'll have to confront that. But you can agree on what PAC and CAISO or PAC and CAISO and individual other early joiners like Portland may need. And then there's a separate issue of as the RTO boundaries change, SPP and CAISO will have to start talking about joint congestion management. It isn't a big issue, necessarily now, but I understand, I'm not totally in tune with that, but I understand there are pretty significant loop flows in some areas already. And then maybe we should already be having that discussion about flow entitlements and loop flows. And maybe it is occurring and I just don't know about it because I'm not in, we're only involved in some things or maybe a lot happening we don't know about. So, but that in terms of what has to happen, we should have joint congestion management discussions with CAISO and SPP, and maybe they're already happening, maybe they're not. And then as the configurations change, those discussions get more complicated. As Richard Doing has pointed out in a number of presentations and papers, configuration matters a lot, and you can make joint congestion management easy or nightmarish, depending on grid configurations of the ISO. So that's another factor.
Yeah, thanks for raising this. My reaction, so there's a couple layers here. One is the examples that Scott has raised is actually in the context of neighboring ISOs that have to manage seams and loop flow issues with each other. And so that is more directly analogous to the Markets Plus EDAM issues that you raised. And it seems like it is the sort of standard solution to that, or one of the better, least worst solutions to that sort of problem. There are better solutions for balancing areas that are jointly part of the same ISO. And there are worse solutions. And I think we're trying to kind of move to a better solution than the current one. Not to say that you have a bigger toolkit, I think, at your disposal when you're talking about balancing areas that share the same ISO and can price everything sort of simultaneously and do simultaneous feasibility and all of that. But that doesn't mean that this could be an improvement over the existing sort of circumstances. But I do think we should, probably start thinking sooner rather than later about the same sorts of issues happening between the two bigger market footprints. And it seems like this is sort of the standard approach for trying to deal with that in the lack of anything better.
Thanks. I appreciate those perspectives, and we'll keep the conversation going.
Okay, thanks, Dan. So nobody else in queue, so I think we're ready to go on and hear what Guillermo has to say, the latest and greatest from the data analyses that he's been doing.
Thank you, Ben, for the introduction. Good morning, everybody. Before I go into the technical aspects of this discussion, I just want to take a moment to thank you, Ben and Scott, for all the insights, the guidance, and the thoughtful challenges that you have brought to our analysis to make sure that we continuously push ourselves to improve and do better. Scott, thank you for the many years of service and contributions you have made to the CAISO. I happened to meet Scott back in 2007 when my first task was the assignment to go after price validation for preparation of the MRTU. Since then, he has provided very valuable perspectives and guidance on much of the work and the analysis that we have done since then across the dozens of initiatives that we have taken. Ben, thank you for the many contributions you have provided, not only to the CAISO market, but at large in your research. I happened to meet Ben even before I joined the ISO. Indeed, Ben's research inspired me for the type of PhD research that I did on game theory to analyze model competition and market power in electricity markets. So it goes back that long. You both have made lasting contributions to improve our markets, and not just our markets, but the market at large. We will miss you. Thank you for all your service. Now let me go into
all the analysis, because I really appreciate it. It's very hard for us where we don't, we're not working for market participants. We don't have access to data, and it's great to have you I'm constantly badgering you for more data and creating your 110-hour-a-week work week where I get stuff from you at midnight all the time. So thank you for all the help.
Thank you, Scott.
Yeah. Thank you, Guillermo, for the compliment. I remember when you and I wrote articles discussing some competitive issues back and forth, and we were arguing about whether the devil was in the details or not. And those wound up being, I mean, there's nothing an academic likes is getting a citation, and you gave me a citation. So you were my friend right from the beginning.
Thank you. I remember that paper very well. Okay, with that, let me go into the technical discussion for this topic today. And I have to make a big disclaimer for what you are going to hear. The analysis we're presenting today, it's not a crystal ball of what the EDAM market solution costs are going to be. We have been very explicit to indicate that there are many uncertainties, variables that we cannot predict perfectly. And what we are coming with today is an assessment based on historical congestion that we have observed in the Western energy imbalance market. We are effectively taking that as a proxy to see potentially what could be a landscape that we may have once we go live with the extended day-ahead market. Another area of interest here is that the goal and scope of this analysis from the beginning, after we discussed the market surveillance opinion about the day-ahead and extended day-ahead market and the congestion revenue allocation, has been really to ensure that we can provide as much transparency and insights before going live, to ensure that we are with a good perspective of how things could play out by the day we go live and avoid any surprises. As the discussion of the congestion revenue allocation has evolved into the longer term, we have heard from participants, we appreciate the insights that we may have to evolve this analysis into a wider footprint. The footprint that we have focused on is specifically the go-live footprint that consists of Pacific West, Pacific East, and the California balancing areas. Can we move to the next slide, please? Now, the starting point for this analysis was predicated on the feedback that we got from the Market Surveillance Committee back to the time where the opinion was issued. There was a general consensus about the interest and the need to have additional information of potentially what would be the implications of having this congestion revenue allocation design related to the extended day-ahead market. Taking all that feedback into account, what we came as a plan was to develop a two-stage analysis approach. The first stage that we completed back in December, that we published a paper, we have a stakeholder call as part of the congestion revenue allocation initiative, was mainly on assessing the structural nature of the congestion of the EDAM footprint, relying on historical information of the Western energy imbalance market. The second part, as we committed to do, is more related to the assessment, the potential impacts of having the congestion revenue allocation when it comes to congestion rents. The scope of all these two stages is limited to the footprint of the EDAM go live, PAC East, PAC West, and CAISO balancing areas. And we are open to explore for the longer term analysis how this could potentially translate to a wider footprint. The first stage is already captured in a paper that we published in December, and part of that analysis we are bringing it back today for discussion. And the scope of this presentation today is mostly on the area of the impact assessment, and it is in terms of dollar impact. Given the disclaimer I made at the beginning, I want to emphasize again, this is an assessment based on historical congestion observed in the Western energy imbalance market. It is a proxy for what we could see for the extended day-ahead market. Taking that as a baseline, obviously there are many assumptions that could be made to make these estimates more optimistic, more liberal, more conservative, and it's a matter of what assumptions we can logically and rationally consider to be a good reflection of the dynamics that could be observed in the extended day-ahead market. Next slide, please. Let me start with the main takeaway, and I will unpack this information throughout the rest of the presentation. This is a summary of the impact assessment as a proxy using the real-time market congestion. We have done assessment for the congestion rents, the impacts of the transactions in one area on another area, specifically from PAC area into the CAISO area. And what we have here is an estimate, again, using the historical congestion of the energy imbalance market. We assess this for a 2-year period, 2024, 2025, and we have an estimate in terms of potentially what would be the congestion revenues, the congestion rents related to parallel flows associated with transactions from PAC areas into the CAISO area and vice versa. The analysis you are going to see for the rest of the presentation just provides more context and details on this number. Overall, we are assessing the impact in 3 areas. 2 of these areas are related specifically to the transfers that may happen from Pacific East to Pacific West that may cause parallel flows on the CAISO balancing area. And we look at specifically on the prevailing flows. The information that is listed here is specific to the prevailing flows in which the congestion management is going to charge congestion to the transactions of PAC due to the congestion observed in transmission constraints in the CAISO. There are 3 columns here, just to put perspective and a comparison of how this reflects on the different approaches that we have. The first column is what we currently have for the day-ahead market. As of now, the day-ahead market runs and optimizes and do congestion management specific to the California balancing area. We price congestion only related to constraints within the California balancing area. We redispatch resources within the CAISO balancing area to do that congestion management. But as part of the full network model that we utilize to do the congestion configuration of the system, we do model explicitly the rest of the Western interconnection in the market application. It happens that any transactions, any generation or demand that could be outside of the CAISO balancing area is not priced, is not optimized in the day-ahead market. And therefore, it doesn't accrue congestion rents, neither in the prevailing or the counterflow direction. That is the reason that in the current day-ahead construct, what we see is that any transactions of transfers from PAC East to PAC West do not collect any congestion rents in the prevailing flow direction. The second area of analysis that we have is related to potential incentives for self-scheduled generation within each balancing area of PAC East and PAC West, and how those generations being self-scheduled and using the network service rights could translate into parallel flows into the California balancing area. The same thing, even though there may be generation meeting demand within each of the PAC areas currently, these are not optimized through the day-ahead market, and therefore, even though there may be parallel flows, they are not priced in the context of the congestion management of the CAISO balancing area, and therefore there are no congestion rents associated with those self-scheduled generation within each PAC area. The current reference, current day-ahead market is that we do not collect any congestion rents due to this type of transactions. Now, the second column refers to the original congestion revenue allocation that was envisioned as part of the extended day-ahead market, in which we do congestion management not only for the CAISO balancing area, but also for each of the PAC balancing areas. It's part of the wider footprint. We do effectively congestion management as part of the wider footprint, in which we redispatch resources across the footprint. And that means effectively there may be redispatches of resources in one area to do congestion management in another balancing area. Transactions in PAC may cause congestion in CAISO constraints, and therefore there would be price signals related to that. Now, under the EDAM market structure, we will have redispatch, we will have congestion management in the wider footprint, and therefore there would be congestion rents collected by virtue of applying that congestion management. The original congestion revenue allocation indicated that as long as there is prevailing flows impacting transmission constraints, they contribute to congestion, and therefore there will be congestion rents collected on that contribution. That congestion remains where the congestion was generated in the CAISO transmission constraints. That is about $60 million for transfers between PAC East and PAC West, and about $39 million for self-scheduled generation within PAC East and PAC West. And this is for a 2-year period. So if you split that by half, that would be the total cost per year. If you get an average for every month, that would be in the range of $1.6 and $2.5 million per month. That is a proxy using the real-time congestion to be a baseline of potentially what could be in the day ahead, with all the caveats that this implies. Now, the last column is the revised congestion revenue allocation, in which there are provisions for the transactions, either transfers or self-schedule generation associated with exercise of rights that could be returned the money when there is a congestion charge. Effectively, those $59.1 million for the 2 years associated with the transfers would be returned back to PAC by virtue of this revised methodology. And effectively, that exposure of congestion goes away under this congestion revenue allocation. That would be the reference of the 3 points to have an assessment of the implications of the congestion revenue allocation methodology. Current status, original methodology, revised methodology.
Sorry, Guillermo, is this a summary of your current numbers, or is this more of a representative example to try to walk us through the 3 sort of flavors of calculations?
This is the summary of the many more granular values that we described in the rest of the presentation, Jim.
Okay, all right. So at a high level then, and maybe we'll get to this, it looks like there's very little counterflow, if any, that it's all flow. Because the third column, if there was a lot of counterflow, would show some differences there.
Yeah, and that's a very good point. This illustration only focuses on the prevailing flow, that is the direction where we collect congestion rents and we pay that back. But you are right that there is a second part related to the counterflows, and we have those numbers in the rest of the presentation, in which we pay for counterflows, and then as part of the congestion revenue allocation, that money is clawed back just to basically do the full cycle here. So it goes both ways. Here, for simplicity, I'm referring only to the prevailing flows.
Okay, so these numbers do not include any counterflow calculation.
Correct. We have a specific breakdown for counterflows.
Got it. All right.
Can we move to the next slide, please? Now, before I go into the specifics of the impact assessment, I want to spend a couple of minutes going into the context. I think it's very important to understand not just the dollar magnitude of potentially what could be the implications, but really understand the structural conditions that we have in the system. I would have to say that there is a physical reality here that is basically defined by the transmission configuration of the actual system. These are the physical laws, the Kirchhoff law of how power flows given the actual transmission system. On top of that, we can impose different market mechanisms, contractual agreements, but they do not override the nature of how the power is going to flow. An interest to have this conversation is to really emphasize that there is a structural setup, a structural configuration of the transmission system that bounds how those power flows, these counter prevailing flows or parallel flows are going to realize. Then it becomes a matter of how much they are going to happen, how frequently they are going to happen, how expensive they are going to happen. But the reality of the transmission system is there. This illustration goes into the EDAM footprint that is composed by PAC East, West, and CAISO, indicating that when we have a transaction that may go from PAC East to PAC West, that is the illustration on the left, there will be all these flows generated from PAC East to reach PAC West that go not just through the straight line that may connect PAC West to PAC East, just because of the loop flow that we have in the system, or the interconnection that we have in the Western, there will be flows that will go throughout the rest of the system to different degrees based on the effectiveness and the characteristics of the transmission system. But to the point that there will be some flows that eventually go through the transmission system of the California balancing area and in many other transmission areas as well. Depending on the direction of the congestion experience in the California balancing area, relative to the direction of the transactions between PAC East and PAC West, those parallel flows, those that are going through the CAISO system, emanated from the transactions of PAC, could be in the same direction, prevailing flows, or it could be in the opposite direction to the congestion that we have in the CAISO system. That would be counterflows. Prevailing flows are going to be charged for contributing, for exacerbating the congestion. Counterflows are going to get paid for relieving the congestion and would enable additional transactions in the prevailing direction. The same thing can happen the other way around. When we have transactions happening within the CAISO balancing area that may go from north to south or vice versa, and therefore because of the mesh network that we have, some of those are going to go through different balancing areas, including areas in PAC East and PAC West. Where each balancing area is located relative to the balancing area that you are analyzing is pretty critical, because that is going to define the magnitude, the extent of these parallel flows. If you have an area that could be far in the Pacific Northwest, most likely the parallel flows are going to be modest because there is not much loop flows. But if you have areas that encompass wider footprints along the California balancing area, that may be bounded to have more significant parallel flows. Next slide, please. When we talk about parallel flows, relative to the footprint that we have for the go-live EDAM, it is a very simple matrix. We have transactions in either PAC areas or CAISO areas, and depending on what constraints they are going to impact. If they are impacting constraints within their own balancing area, these are just internal flows that resources are going in that area are going to be effective to manage. When they go into constraints that are in the CAISO, that is what we call the parallel flows. And the analogy happens for the transactions that are in the CAISO. When we have transactions in CAISO creating congestion on internal constraints, these are just internal flows. But the flows that are originated on CAISO, on PAC constraints, are going to be the corresponding parallel flows on the PAC area. It's a very symmetrical condition given the setup that we have. How do we go with the estimation of these parallel flows? Well, we have the history of congestion in the Western Energy Imbalance Market. We know the shadow prices, the congestion prices of the different locations and constraints in the footprint. We know also the sensitivity factors, the shift factors applicable for each location relative to each transmission constraint that was congested. And we also know the information of the transfers, either base transfers, optimized transfers in the EIM, and the generation locations that we have in the footprint. In some cases, we can use the aggregated location for generation, that would be the DGAPs. In other cases, to model the sinks, the demand side, we use the aggregated location for the demand, that is the ELAPs. And the transactions that we can formulate for PAC transactions can go from a source to a sink, that could be from PAC East to PAC West, from an individual generator to a ELAP aggregation point as a sink, or it could be, for instance, internal individual generation points for self-schedules, syncing at the aggregated demand of the corresponding balancing area. It could be all this type of permutation depending on either of the three phases of the analysis that we have. Next slide, please. This is a snapshot that we have provided in the past, I believe in the session that we have in January, and also in the briefing that we provided to the board back in December. And just highlights the inherent nature of the parallel flows that could be observed when you have transactions in one area applicable to flows on another area. This is the snapshot of the handful of constraints that are located in the California balancing area, and how by modeling different transactions between PAC East and PAC West, they would impact the flow contributions on these specific CAISO constraints. There will be obviously conditions depending on the time of the year, the seasonal conditions, the nature of the transactions, in which the constraints can be impacted by either counter flows or prevailing flows. They may be mitigating or exacerbating congestion on the CAISO constraints and the corresponding consequences of congestion rents on that constraint. These values that are represented with minimum and maximum ranges, because this is capturing, for instance, a quarter. And in a quarter, the shift factors can vary a lot because we calculate shift factors basically for every 15 minutes. In a quarter, you can have wild changes in the configuration of the system that can give you a variation of shift factors. So the ranges really reflect the nature that is capturing the sensitivity factors over a period of time. And that gives you a sense, depending on the time of the year, how widely the changes of the shift factors could be. The second point of interest here is the magnitude of these shift factors. They are represented in percentages, and you can see that there are some constraints that are quite significantly impacted by parallel flows on the CAISO system. They could range from -40% to +40%, indicating that if there were a transaction from PAC East to PAC West, there could be potentially up to 40% of flow contribution on some transmission constraints in the CAISO, either prevailing flow or counter flow, depending on the time and conditions of the congestion. There are many other constraints that can have a very modest, negligible effect of parallel flows. And again, everything is related to where the transaction is located relative to what configuration of the transmission system we have. Many of the constraints that are greatly impacted, not surprisingly, happen to be in the backbone of the transmission system of the California. The Midway Vincent, the Gateway, the Los Banos constraints, all these are the backbone of the center piece of the transmission system in California. There are many other constraints that are more localized, either located in the corner of the northern part of the system or the southern part of the system, that naturally are not going to be exposed to that level of parallel flows. Next slide, please. In addition to the inherent nature, the physical nature of the transmission configuration, the other factor that determines the extent of the congestion is really how frequently they are congested. And not only how frequently, but also how expensively that congestion is priced. We did some statistics just to get a sense of the size of the congestion that we have in the system. This metric highlights the frequency of the congestion experienced in the Western Energy Imbalance Market, specific for the footprint of the EDAM. And what we see is that over 75% of the congestion seen in the California balancing area is not exposed or impacted by parallel flows, either prevailing flows or counter flows. That is the light blue color in the trend on the right-hand side. The reds are really the frequency of constraints that could be exposed to parallel flows, either in the CAISO balancing area or in either of the PAC balancing areas. About 25% of all the congestion observed in the footprint would be related to CAISO area that could be impacted by parallel flows, while there is a small portion of constraints located in PAC areas that could be exposed to parallel flows, in part because there are very few constraints congested and been binding in the PAC areas. On the right-hand side of this illustration, there is also another statistic, and that is the number of constraints that in that quarter were binding, were congested overall, just to give you a magnitude sense of the extent of the constraints that we have congested at any time in the system. And Ben, I see a hand. I don't know if you want to take that question now or for later.
Let's now. Is that what the thumbs
Yeah.
up? Yeah, let's take it now.
Yes, go ahead, so this is Michelle, and always glad to hear from her. So,
So this is Michelle. I don't know what page it was, but you said that the effects were like 1.6 and 2.5. So those are just dividing by 12 months and 2 years. Now, I just want to understand, is that the effect of the difference between base schedule and the redispatch, or is it all packed transactions?
It's all packed transactions, and I will expand on that in the subsequent slides, Michelle.
Okay, great. Thank you.
You're welcome. Next slide, please. Now, let's go into the matter of how we can set up an analysis to come with an estimate. I have to say, I'm always hesitant to come with a dollar impact because we don't have the capability to have this crystal ball to assess the actual cost of the EDAM, right? But we can do some logical, rational approximation of a proxy based on what we know. And what we know is no more than the congestion experienced in the Western energy imbalance market in a historical fashion. How do we estimate any impact, dollar impact? Well, there are at least 5 elements that you have to come with to eventually be able to put a dollar value to that estimate. If everything is related to congestion, we need to know what constraints are congested, right? If on average we have 140 constraints congested at any point on time in the CAISO system, out of those, how frequently they are congested? We may have that many constraints. Some of them may be binding or congested in a very tiny frequency, while others could be consistently congested, right? The frequency also matters. Then it is a matter of not only knowing when they are congested, but also how severe the congestion is. You may have congestion that is priced very low because it's very economic, in the range of a few dollars, versus other constraints that may be close to the bid cap of $1,000, indicating that it's a very tight constraint condition. The severity matters a lot, and that is measured by the shadow price of the constraint. That is information that is publicly available, and eventually those shadow prices are decomposed based on the sensitivity factors to make up what we define as the marginal congestion component of the LMPs. Then the most critical piece, no doubt, is also the configuration of the system. And that is measured by the sensitivity factors, the shift factors, that tell us how effective or how meaningful the redispatch of locations are relative to every single constraint. And that is a physical reality, depending how they are electrically connected and located relative to the transmission constraint. And the last piece is that we also need to know, in addition to all this information, what volume we have to assess. You can have the prices, you can have the sensitivity, but you need to know what volume of transactions we are expecting to measure to come with the total dollar cost. All this, to some extent, may require different assumptions. The one that we can know with some level of certainty is the sensitivity factors. That is the reality of the transmission system. But any other of the remaining 4 elements are subject to assumptions. What assumptions we make to assume that the congestion experience in the real time is going to be happening at the same frequency, at the same severity in the EDAM, when we have different footprints, when we will have different generation mix to redispatch resources, when participation in the day-ahead market may be not exactly the same participation we have in the real-time market. Every one of those can really represent a set of assumptions we have to make to come with some proxy of the extent of the assessment that we want to take. Next slide, please. in order to come with this analysis, we do have to make some assumptions. Some of those are explicit. Some of those are going to be implied by just the approximation we take. We are anchoring all this analysis on the historical congestion that we have in the EIM market. And this is just a proxy of potentially what could be seen for the extended day-ahead market. We are using the 15-minute historical prices for congestion, the shadow prices. We are using the same shift factors on the 15-minute market solution that represents the transmission configuration that is applicable in the real time. The congestion management that we use in the real-time market comes with the optimal solution that includes the congestion management, that defines what is the optimal redispatch of resources and is reflected also by the price of the congestion that we have in the system. That is predicated on the resources that are effectively available in the real-time market to be redispatched to manage that congestion. For the real-time market, those resources happen to be not only located in PAC East, PAC West, and CAISO balancing area, but also across the other 19 balancing areas that are currently part of the EIM market. When we go into the EDAM market, that redispatch is not going to be available, but we will have resources that can be redispatched in any of the 3 balancing areas that compose the EDAM footprint. That is a difference that we have between the real-time and the EDAM. Taking the real-time as a proxy comes with the assumption that you may have the same level of flexibility and controls in the day-ahead market to what you may have in the real-time. An area that we're going to see later is that we do have congestion in both the day-ahead and the real-time market for the CAISO balancing area. Now, on the opposite side to the previous statement, right now, the congestion that we price and that we see in the day-ahead market is only based on the redispatch that we do for resources contained within the CAISO balancing area. That is the only area available for the day-ahead market. Once we go with the EDAM, it will be more than that, because now we will have explicit controls to redispatch resources in PAC East and PAC West to do the congestion management, not only for the CAISO balancing area, but also for PAC balancing areas. Next slide, please. There is another level of assumptions now we have to do. What information can we logically and rationally take from the real-time market? From the real-time market, we have different elements of information. We know the congestion prices, we know the transmission constraints that are binding, we know the shift factors, we know how the resources were dispatched in the real-time market, effectively the FMM 15-minute market schedules and awards. We know what transfers were optimized, but also what transfers were used as base transfers, those that are not optimized in the market. Depending on the assumptions that you can take, this could be different levels of assumptions that we can rely on. For instance, there could be at least 3 levels of assumptions that could be implied in the information that we use, by the way we use the information. One assumption is for the incentives related to self-scheduling. When we have to determine what level of generation can we assume would be incentivized to self-schedule given the congestion revenue allocation methodology. That is the upper right part of the illustration here, where generation within a balancing area, PAC East or PAC West, is going to be used, potentially self-scheduled, to meet the demand in that same balancing area. If there is associated congestion revenue allocation, there could be an incentive to utilize that generation with self-schedules. That requires to make the assumption of what level of generation could be incentivized to self-schedule. There are not many options to take. One option is to either take the 15-minute schedules, the optimal schedules of the 15-minute market, or the base schedules that were used to come balance to the market. Each of these approaches imply different assumptions. The analysis that we are putting forward for this impact assessment uses the assumption of relying on the base schedules. When we come to the real-time market, each balancing area has to go through the resource sufficiency evaluation. And basically, they have to come in balance. Supply equals demand. That balance of demand with the supply available can be met with different types of supply, internal generation or imports and exports. If we just pause for a moment and we put the context of how the current scheduling practices could be done, well, the base transfers, the base schedules could be a good reflection of what the day-ahead scheduling practice is and how they come into the real-time market participation using that as a baseline. So the assumption we are making here is that if we use the base generation as the proxy of potentially what the schedules could be self-scheduled, what generation could be self-scheduled in the day-ahead market, we have a, relatively speaking, robust proxy based on the real-time information. This base generation is not based on the optimization of the real-time market. This is the scheduling that they are putting forward to balance their system before entering the real-time market. In contrast, we could take a different approximation, and that assumption would be, well, let's just take the optimal schedules of the generation that was clear in the real-time market. That has some implied assumptions that could potentially distort the level of incentives we could estimate. By using the 15-minute clear schedules, the assumptions are the following. If those 15-minute schedules were at certain level, not only to meet their internal generation, but also to support economic transfers that were part of the market solution in the 15-minute market, effectively, we're indicating that using the 15-minute schedules as the proxy, we are going to assume that the realized transfers in the real-time market are expected to be realized also in the day-ahead market. That could be okay when we have the footprint including PAC. But if there are resources in PAC that are being dispatched to support transfers that may go to any non-EDAM entity, these transfers are not expected to be realized in the EDAM. And even if they were realized in the EDAM, they will not be priced in the EDAM. Because if you have, let's say, a transaction going from PAC East to Nevada or to Idaho to support a transfer, that is a generation that is dispatched to support that transfer. And that transfer, when we go into the extended day-ahead market, is not going to be there. If that transfer happens to be in the day-ahead market, it's going to be outside of the market. It's going to be a bilateral transaction. And that is not going to be priced as part of the congestion management in the extended day-ahead market. Therefore, using the 15-minute market schedules could be inflating the estimates by assuming that any schedule that was dispatched in the 15-minute market to support potential transfers could be still an incentive to self-schedule generation in that balancing area. That is the main drawback that we found to use the 15-minute market schedules, and the reason to use the base schedule as the proxy for the estimation of the incentives to self-schedule generation. The other approximation you have to make is for this specific use to exercise transmission rights from PAC East to PAC West. We have information from the real-time market about the optimized transfers going from PAC East to PAC West. It is bounded up to 300 megawatts, and we saw that happening at any range all the time. it is part of the optimization. We can assume that that optimized transfers may continue to exist in the EDAM because it's going to be part of the EDAM footprint. In addition to the optimized transfers, we also know the base schedules, the base transfers going from PAC East to PAC West, and it's only in one direction, in that direction. Using the base transfers for us is a good proxy of potentially what could be the level of rights that are going to be exercised in PAC that could impact the parallel flows in the CAISO balancing area. That is what I found to be a reasonable, logical approximation of a proxy of the level, the magnitude of the transactions that we could use for this impact assessment. We know the prices, we know the shift factors, we are looking for what volume, what megawatt we can assume for making a dollar estimate, and this is what we feel confident to use as a proxy. Next slide, please. How do we come with the impact assessment? We have three buckets of dollar impact. One is we take the approximation of the base transfers to be a proxy of potentially what rights are going to be exercised from PAC East to PAC West when we are in the EDAM. If they have been using those base transfers to balance their supply demand between areas, it's logical to expect that we could see at least that much of transmission rights being exercised in the EDAM. The second component is the optimized transfers that we derive from the real-time market. These are the EIM transfers. We quantify the transfers going from PAC East to PAC West as part of the optimal solution of the EIM. We take that also as a second component of the transfers that we can logically expect that could be realized in the EDAM market. And the third one is about the incentive for self-scheduled generation. We are using the base generation in PAC East and PAC West individually to be the proxy for the volumes of self-scheduled generation in the EDAM. Now, there could be cases where the base generation in one area could be greater than the demand they have to meet because they may be supporting transfers. What we do is we cap the level of self-generation up to the amount of the demand of that balancing area. Because as I understand, the network service rights basically have the limitation that they can be used up to meeting the demand of the balancing area. These are the three stages of analysis that we have done based on the assumptions that I just described to have some proxy to give us a reference of the volumes that we can match with the prices and come with the dollar impact assessment that we have. Next slide, please. The impact 1 and 2 related to transfers between PAC East and PAC West are basically put together. Now, we use the base transfers plus the optimized transfers of the EIM. We know that there could be potentially higher transfer capabilities from PAC East to PAC West that could be used. Here we do an extra step. It's just a simple sensitivity analysis. In addition to having the scenario of relying on the historical base transfers, we do this sensitivity analysis. What if the transfers exercised in EDAM were at the level of 300, 600, 900, up to 1,200 megawatts? What would be the corresponding cost if we were to assume this level of volumes are happening for the transfers from PAC East to PAC West? Next slide, please. With that, we have this summary of the impact assessment related to the first two items that are narrowly defined for the transfers. We have the first line that is the prevailing cost or counterflow cost related only to the optimized transfers in the real-time market. This is any transaction that was optimized as part of the EIM market up to 300 megawatts, but because that is the capability that is available in the real-time market. The cost is relatively modest, and it's about $0.13 million in the prevailing direction, minus 0.04 in the counterflow direction. The second line is the estimate if we take as a proxy all the base transfers from Pac East to Pac West. On average, and this is actually average per month, it is $2.34 million in the prevailing direction and minus $0.13 million in the counterflow direction. That would be just anchoring the assessment on the historical base transfers and optimized EIM transfers. The subsequent rows of 300 all the way through 1200 megawatts is for the sensitivity analysis of the what-if scenarios. If we were to assume transfer were to be flat 300 megawatts all the time, consistently from Pac East to Pac West, we are going to get estimates that are in the range of $1.7 million. And for every increased tier of 600, 900, 1200, you proportionally increase the cost. So if we were to assume the most conservative approach, that the transfer exercising the rights from Pac East to Pac West were 1200 megawatts every single hour for the entire period and priced at the historical congestion prices, we would get up to about $7 million per month of prevailing flows and about $1 million in the counterflow direction. Again, I want to emphasize this is what-if scenarios, sensitivity analysis, just using different levels of implied transfer levels between Pac East and Pac West. Next slide, please. And this is just the monthly breakdown, effectively where these costs are accrued. The averages are a very simplistic way to give you a high-level picture of the analysis. Looking more granularly in the monthly fashion gives you some sense also of the seasonality, right? It's not just a flat, consistent profile of congestion. It varies depending on the time of the year. And this trend is composed of the two elements, the base schedules and the optimized transfers in the real time. You can see that the majority of the transactions are related to the base schedules. The costs are mostly on the base schedules. Also, time-wise, you can see that it is quite dynamic based on the seasonality of the time. Not surprisingly, you are going to see that much of these metrics you are going to see in this presentation are going to be greatly impacted by the conditions that we experienced back in January 2024. That is a very obvious outlier that we have here, given the extreme cold weather that we experienced in January, in the Martin Luther King weekend of January. And that is going to influence the averages that we have across the board. Next slide, please. And here is the metrics for the sensitivity analysis. It is a busy metric, but let me try to explain. There is a very low, almost zero value trend in purple that stands for the cumulative cost associated with estimating the congestion rent using the optimized transfers in the EIM. And it's pretty small. That's the reason it's hovering around zero. Then there is a black line that is related to the base schedules. That is the estimates if we were to assume as a proxy all the historical base transfers are considered to replicate in the EDAM. It starts somewhere in the $20 million range in January 2024, and the cumulative grows to about $59 million by the end of the 2-year period. That is effectively the trend that I described earlier today in the summary. The remaining of the trends that you have here belongs to each of the implied different levels of transmission rights exercise, anywhere from $300 all the way to $1,200. Yes, if you take the most extreme case of assuming transmission rights are exercised at 1,200 megawatts, 1,200 megawatts every single hour of the period, you may end up with a total cumulative of around $170 million in a period of 2 years. How realistic that could be is subject to assumptions and a crystal ball. Realistically, I think a good proxy is to stay with the base schedules. That gives you a sense that it's measuring the impact on average to be in the range of 300 to 600 megawatts. It falls in that bandwidth. Any other assumption is going to be subject to what logical assumptions you can justify to take a different approximation for these values. Next slide, please.
Guillermo, before you go on, let me just make sure I understand the base schedule figure right. Is that just the base schedules directly from PAC East to PAC West, or does that include base schedules that go PAC East to, say, Idaho to PAC West?
Yeah, great point, Scott. There are no explicit direct base transfers from PAC East to PAC West. They have passed through other balancing areas, and what we have done is to isolate that configuration to really identify what becomes the effective base transfers from PAC East through other balancing areas reaching PAC West.
Okay, so that the actual historic level of transfers, of base transfers from PAC East to PAC West looks like it's only around 400 megawatts or something on average per hour. Is that right? In the 300 to 600 line, so.
Yeah, dollar-wise, it falls in the range of $300 to $600. When I did some metrics for the base schedules, I think the average was more about 600 megawatts. But there are values that can go obviously much higher or much lower. But on average, could be around 500, 600 megawatts.
Okay, thank you, Guillermo.
Yeah. Next slide, please. The previous slide was the prevailing flows. We do exactly the same math for the counter flows. Naturally, we have much lower estimates for counter flows. There are not that much, but we have some counter flows. It is the same structure, the same construct, and you can see that if we take just the base schedule as a reference, we're talking about $1 million per month of what potentially could be counter flow impact if the base schedules were to realize in the EDAM construct. Next slide, please. Here is another point of reference because this is a good way to test the type of assumptions we are making. We are taking the assumption of using as a proxy the historical real-time congestion. And we are taking the portion that belongs to parallel flows, either prevailing or counter flows. Something interesting to appreciate here is if we just take that value as a whole, 1 million, 2 million, it lacks the context of how material that is, right? Because we don't know the bigger picture of what is the total congestion in the system. Now, in reality, in the real-time market, yes, we price congestion. The congestion rents, however, are only allocated to the incremental relative to the day ahead. So even though you may have very extreme prices in the real time for congestion, the volume that is actually settled is just for the incrementals relative to the day ahead, and therefore is relatively small. But we have to put that aside. If we are saying at face value, I'm going to assume the congestion price in the real time is going to be the same price in the day ahead market. Now we can take the extra step to assess the total congestion rents based on the value of the real time reference. Because we're already pricing in that way the parallel flows. So this plot is giving you some context. The first bar in blue is the contribution or the portion of the total flows measured on congestion rents for some of the top 6 constraints. And let's say, for instance, the first constraint, that is the nomogram, that is the COID in the northern part of the system, separating the Pacific Northwest with the CAISO. That constraint experienced, based on historical real-time congestion, about $18 million of parallel flows in total for the 2 years. That is about 20%, 23% of the congestion in total that was observed for that constraint in the real-time market, under the assumption that we are pricing the full volume of that constraint at the face value of the congestion. Because the total congestion in that case is about, I believe, $70 million. It happens that this constraint is actually not enforced in the day-ahead market. If we were to move now to do some sanity check, what is the level of actual congestion observed in the day-ahead market as of now? The reference for that constraint is 0. There is no constraint enforced in the day-ahead market. There is no congestion rent collected in the day-ahead market for that constraint. If we move to the next line, that would be the gateway midway constraint, one of the backbone constraints that we have in the system. That constraint has an associated congestion rent on parallel flows that is about 17%, relative to the total congestion rent that would be accrued pricing at the real-time prices. And that happens to be much lower than the congestion that we currently observe in actual in the day-ahead market. I think it's important to give you this context, not just look at the individual value dollar of the congestion rents of the parallel flows in isolation, but have that in context to the total of the congestion that could be priced based on the real time and how that plays relative to the day ahead. Next slide, please. This is just a breakdown when we go specifically into the constraints. This is organized by the top constraints for counterflow, prevailing flows, by year, just to give you a sense that it is indeed a handful of constraints that are accruing the majority of the parallel flows. Next slide, please. Let me move now into the third component of the analysis, and that is the incentive to self-schedule generation within a balancing area to meet the demand within that balancing area. Same approximations that I just explained, real-time information, take it at face value, the level of self-schedule cap up to the demand of that area to mimic the nature of the rights that can be exercised, only to meet up to the demand, using the base generation as the reference of the volumes that we can estimate to be incentivized for self-schedules. Next slide, please. And here is the estimate using that information. As expected, there are higher congestion rents expected to be happening in January 2024, also for the third component of generation self-schedule, just because of the high prices of congestion that we observe in the system. It is also a trend that varies over time, given the different conditions in the system. The average, if you were to take for 2024, is going to be higher than in 2025, just because of the much higher cost that we experience in the winter conditions of the Martin Luther King. On average, we are seeing that the estimate for self-schedule generation would be about $22.2 million in 2024, 1.1 million in 2025. You can make an average for the 2 years if you wish, but it's relatively modest in the sense of the congestion rent that could be implicated by using the base generation as a proxy for the EDAM.
Yeah, well, I struggle a little bit here trying to understand why this number is so much lower than the other number. Aren't we assuming that all the base schedule would have been self-scheduled? So wouldn't it be the same as the line we had above, which is about $2.5 million a month?
And this is an interesting point, Scott, because I have been struggling to see if the two estimates, one for the transfers and one for the self-generation, should be cumulative or not. I wouldn't see this to be complementary completely, because I believe there could be some space where they overlap. So for the transfers, the simple assumption we are making is that there will be transfers originated from PAC East going to PAC West. And we are pricing the impact of moving that power between the two balancing areas. That is the first component, the transfers alone. Naturally, these transfers have to be supported by some internal generation in PAC East. But we don't go into unpacking the generation component when we assess the transfers. Instead, we assess the generation on its own, separately. When we go for this assessment of the self-scheduled generation, the only reference that we take is we use all the base generation that was used to balance PAC East and PAC West separately.
Okay, just I want to make sure I get, so this isn't a calculation of the difference between the flow impact of generation in PAC East meeting load in PAC East on California constraints. Is that right? And PAC West generation meeting PAC West load on California constraints. Is that right?
Yes, that's right, Scott.
And I understand now that, yeah, that seems additive. That's interesting that it's so large. I didn't anticipate this.
Yeah, and so you're truncating the generation schedules at the native load.
Correct.
And then did you kind of look at whether if you didn't do the truncation, whether the generation schedules, sort of the differential in the generation schedules and load is in the ballpark of what the scheduled flows are?
I don't have that comparison, Jim. I follow the idea. I just limited to the demand.
Just curious. Yeah, it's kind of more of a robustness check.
Yeah, we may be able to check that back at some point in the calculation we have.
Assuming it's going from east to west almost all the time, then it's sort of really just looking at how much more the generation schedule in the east is than the load.
Yeah, good point. Next slide, please. This is the same information now related to the self-schedule, moving internal generation to meet its own demand, broken down by constraint. This is for the PAC East area. Still, you are going to find that there is a handful of constraints that collect all the majority of the parallel flows rents in either prevailing or counterflow positions. Next slide, please. And this is the PAC West. And there are less constraints in PAC West, but it's the same trend. A handful of constraints accruing the majority of the prevailing and counterflow rents. Next slide, please. And the same reference, just to put in context, if we were to compare the contributions of the share of the congestion rents prevailing or counterflow rents relative to the total congestion that we could estimate on the cell under the same fashion for the real time, this is how it would look. So if we take the top constraint, that is the gateway midway constraint, the associated rents for parallel flows on that constraint would be about 10.6% of the total real-time congestion. That happens to be lower than the day-ahead congestion rents. This is again just to provide context and give sense of the magnitude of the dollar figures that we have. And I believe this may be the last slide. Can we move to the next?
There are no more slides.
Okay, perfect. That's the material we have put together for today.
Should we ask a question? see if there's anybody in the line that wants to ask questions before we.
Before your presentation, Scott, yeah, definitely want to see if there's anybody in the audience who would like to ask a question, make a comment. Dan? And anybody else, you line up behind Dan? Dan, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. Hey, Guillermo, Dan Williams from the Energy Authority. So I just can pass the opportunity to say thank you for all the additional information that was provided here. I know the stakeholders have been asking you for a lot over the past couple of months, including myself, and this does provide some really excellent context for moving into the next phase of the initiative. The one thing I may have gotten lost on just a little bit in the last few slides was around the expected amount of self-schedules for bilateral transactions and wheel-throughs. With the current EDAM design and the choices made by the EDAM BAs, there's no economic bidding at the EDAM BA borders, and so all imports and wheels through those areas are going to be self-scheduled, and those are going to be sort of locked in for the day-ahead market because they need to be done in time to get included in the resource efficiency evaluation. But my understanding is that they will, even though they're self-schedules and they're coming in probably on contract path transmission, they will get included in the optimization and sort of included in the congestion calculation when the day-ahead market runs. Just because they're coming in at those interface points. So is there anything there that you can comment on as far as like the level of self-scheduled imports and wheels that is or is not represented in the data you just showed?
Yeah, thank you, Dan, for the comment. Yeah, honestly, I would have to think if there is anything that we can leverage from the real-time information that could give us any guidance to the extent, right? I'm afraid that we would have to go more into the assumption mode of what we can consider. So I'm not optimistic that we would be able to see information in the real time that could be meaningful to extrapolate for the day ahead.
Yeah, and this is Milos. Keep in mind, Dan, as well, in EDAM, not everything, designated network resources can be economically bid. So if there's external designated network resources that are serving load in Pacificor, those can be economically bid. They don't have to be self-scheduled. And this is really tied with the exercise of transmission rights. So self-schedule paired with the exercise of rights is what accrues that unique allocation. So all that to say is I would not assume that every single import is self-scheduled. I would expect to see some volume, particularly with Pacificor, in light of different resources that are external, that are designated to serve loads within Pacificor's area. Those can be economically bid. They may or may not do it, but that's an option.
That's a good point, Milos. I maybe painted with too broad of a brush there, but I guess the good thing is that the market's going to be live soon, and so we'll start to get real data on the sort of self-scheduled imports there. But my expectation is that a lot of the activity that's carrying forward from sort of the current market is just represented in base schedules that are being brought into EIM that maybe represent forward contracts and PPAs and such that are going to be self-scheduled now in EDAM, but just have been showing up as base schedules, bilateral transactions in EIM right now that aren't being optimized through EIM.
Well, wouldn't the base schedules be, wouldn't the transactions be a base schedule in the Western EIM? They'd show it coming in and it'd be part of their resource efficiency evaluation. It seems to me they would be base schedules, but they wouldn't be base schedules going between PAC East and PAC West necessarily. They could be base schedules going from PAC East to Nevada or Nevada to PAC West or whatever.
Yeah, Scott, and that's what I'm thinking is that the majority of them are that we'd be looking at would be base schedules that are showing up in EIM that are bilateral transactions from a participating or non-participating resource in EIM, but are tagged on contract path transmission and then represented as base schedules by the EIM BAs in the model.
Right. So they should be in the base schedule data. Just have to pull it out. As you said, we'll probably see the the simulation results and the live results before we'll figure that out.
Yeah, and then just the last comment I wanted to make too is that I know we've focused on PacifiCorp data here, but the inclusion of PGE and EDAM coming up in October does open up a much larger transfer path with the COI. So I hope as we get deeper into this effort, and once we've sort of gotten past the go live date, that we can kind of turn to looking at congestion revenue allocation with some insights from the PGE, and then expectations for bank, which will also have huge transfers with CAISO at that point too.
Yeah, point taken then.
Okay. Thanks, Dan. So I think now we're ready to go, Scott, to your presentations. And as a time check, we do not have to end at noon sharp. We can go over. So Scott, you should feel free to take the time you need to make your points and to have the discussion that the points deserve.
Right. I think some of the points I'm going to make are fairly simple, so it won't take long. There's more slides than I'm going to talk about. So, but let's go to the next slide, please. And all I'm highlighting in this presentation that there are three designs to be compared. There's the current Western EIM design, which is where everybody is now, PAC East, PAC West, Portland General, Nevada, everybody, that's what they're in. And then we got the original EDAM schedule design, and then we got the go live EDAM schedule design. And their differences in terms of right now in the Western EIM, base schedules don't pay congestion and aren't paid for counterflow. And then when we go to the original EDAM design, we had all EDAM transactions pay congestion, and all EDAM transactions are paid for counterflow. And then when we get to the go live, we've got CRN tag transactions don't pay congestion, but everything that isn't tagged that way does get paid for counterflow. So, so basically by intentionally not tagging a counterflow transaction, you can, get paid for it and do better than you are in that Western EIM. So I'm going to contrast this a little bit and try to set up an understanding how this is a little bit different. It's kind of talked about in Guillermo's analysis, but not highlighted. Go to the next slide. And this just refers to the old DMM data that we talked about in our opinion, and the limitations of that data relative to the current CAISO data is that it was aggregated, it was distorted by averaging over the day and averaging over the months of each quarter. And the data that the CAISO made available in December didn't do that. So go to the next slide. And here's what I'm thinking about in terms of the multiple comparisons. So you can look at for June 2024 under the Western EIM schedule, design and price-based schedule, PAC wouldn't have paid anything for any of the schedules from PAC East to PAC West because they were all base schedules. They weren't charged for anything. And under the original EDAM design, they would be charged for prevailing flow impacts and paid for counterflow impacts. And what these numbers are, this could be confusing, but what I did is I took the CAISO data, and it's an average number for each month. So it's an average congestion for each hour. So I added up all the positive hours and I added up all the negative hours, and the net's going to be the same. But you decompose it into the positives and negatives. And again, assuming that if it's prevailing congestion, you're going to give it a CRN tag. And if it's counterflow, you're not, so that you get paid for it. So that's how these different designs would shake out a little differently. And it didn't matter in the original EDAM schedule because it didn't matter if you tagged it. You're going to pay congestion and get paid for counterflow. But now with the GoLive design, there's this additional element. And I think Guillermo's presentation focused on the difference of the GoLive relative to the original EDAM, and you can see that they don't pay congestion in the GoLive, so that's a $7.8 million swing. But if you look at it relative to the base schedule, in this month it's a $17 a day swing because you're getting paid for the counterflow and you're not paying for the prevailing flow. So it's a different shift relative when you compare it relative to the base schedule treatment in the Western EIM, or when you treat it to the original EDAM design. And go to the next slide, just another month to kind of make this point. And this is a different month. This is January 2025, when there was almost all south to north prevailing flow congestion. So with south to north congestion, the PAC East to PAC West schedule is going to be a prevailing flow. So you can see that the average, congestion over an average day was about $36, and there was almost no counterflow. So when you look at the change of the GoLive EDAM relative to the original EDAM design, you see that there's this $36 per day swing per megawatt. And this is for, just to be arbitrary and simplify it, a megawatt that flowed over all 24 hours, but it probably wouldn't. But we don't have data to do it hour by hour. But you can see now there's almost no impact because you get paid for a tiny bit of counterflow, but you weren't charged for anything under the Western EIM. So here there's almost no impact relative to what we're doing today, but a fair amount of impact relative to what would have been the original EDAM design. And then go to the next slide, just another month I picked out. And this is July 2025. And here we got more of a mix on net. We've got overall during the month, we've got more north to south flow, congestion than south to north, but we've got both. So we got some prevailing flow and some counterflow. The prevailing flow is free if it's tagged, and you get paid for counterflow. So you can see there's a small shift between the original EDAM and the GoLive design, but there's a larger shift from the Western EIM design to the GoLive because you're getting paid for the counterflow. So all of these, there are these different comparisons, and everything can look a little bit different depending on whether you're comparing the GoLive to the original EDAM design or the current Western EIM design. And that's because, under the relative to the original EDAM design, you're not paying for prevailing flow, but relative to the Western EIM, you're getting paid for counterflow. So I just wanted to highlight that, the comparisons come out a little differently, depending on how you're doing the comparison. And one more slide, and this is just noting that, and I don't know if this is the way the future is going to be, but if you look at 24 and 25, we've really had a lot of south to north congestion. Part of that is, the solar generation impact, which is probably going to continue, but part of it is also, less water available in the Pacific Northwest and Canada, generally, so that maybe this isn't going to be what it's going to look like in 2 years from now, but it is what it looked like then. So I just want to get that out there that, there are a lot of months where when you look at the CAISO data from December 2010, every hour it was south to north congestion. So if you look at that, there would have been, it's all prevailing flows. So there's no payments for counterflow. And basically this is the same as EDAM. I mean, the same as the Western EIM in all of these months. There's just no difference. Now, that's a little bit of overstatement because there might have been some variations, within the days of the month. Maybe on some days there was actually a large north to south congestion, but this is a, at least a 500-foot analysis. So we're abstracting from that just to give you the big picture. So it kind of shows in a lot of these months, there isn't really going to be a lot of difference between what happened in the actual settlements of the Western EIM and what would happen under EDAM. Now let me go one more page, and this is just a bunch of caveats so that okay, this is just, it's kind of just highlighting this difference, but there are a bunch of caveats. First, I used, as I say here, I used the ELAP congestion component, which is the load component for PAC East. I did that because I thought it would screen out some of the within PAC East congestion because more of the loads on the western side of that. But it's a very rough approximation. And of course, as I said, the table 17 data is still an average over the days of the month. So there's some counterflow and prevailing flow that's getting netted. My tabulations assumed it flowed for 24 hours, which isn't right. It's going to flow more during the load hours than in the middle of the night. But that's just to be illustrative and is what it is. It also assumes that the EDM transmission customer would be able to self-schedule when it was profitable. Some customers might not be able to. So this is just assuming that a customer could actually self-schedule when it saw that it was going to have prevailing flows. And I'm also sort of assuming that the PAC East generation would have been economic to self-schedule given the prices, and that by self-scheduling they didn't end up being uneconomic, and that's a more complicated analysis. So those are just caveats. The whole point really is just to highlight more than I think some of the CAISO stuff has, that they're two comparisons relative to EDAM Go Live and relative to the Western EIM, and I think we all should think about both of those. So I'll stop there. And are there any questions on what I talked about?
Nobody online? Jim?
Yeah, no need to belabor this. This is a pretty simple point. I just thought it'd be good to lay it out and make sure it was clear to everybody. So now go to the second presentation. And what I decided to do is, this is actually, much of it is identical to a presentation I gave in March 2025, talking about the choices before us. So this is sort of an update, trying to word some of it a little bit better and talk about more about, as Milos said, about how we might go ahead. And go to slide 11. As I said, there are a bunch of graphics and illustrations that I think are sort of background that are still relevant, but I don't need to talk about them today. So as I have said, and the expert for the governing body and a bunch of other people have said, tying the allocation of congestion rents to the use of firm transmission or the dispatch of generation can create inefficient incentives, use it or lose it incentives, not only self-scheduling, but also incentives to bid below cost, and in order to get scheduled. And other market areas have generally tried to avoid this. Now, another negative of the current design and tying it in this way is that there is a potential cost shift between entities that can readily self-schedule their resources in order to get the congestion relief, and entities that might not be able to. And that's a little more subtle, but we ought to keep it in mind. It's a pretty arbitrary to say whether or not you've purchased network transmission service, and whether or not you get the congestion rebate, and whether or not you have to pay transmission depends on whether you can self-schedule it, and the self-scheduling itself is inefficient. So there's potential here for cost shifts between entities. It's actually perversely related to, they get hedged if they act inefficiently, and they don't get hedged if for some reason they can't operate inefficiently. So that's another negative of the place we find themselves in. Go ahead, one more slide. And I just want to highlight that, the inefficiencies, a lot of the concern about inefficiencies from self-scheduling historically has been self-scheduling in real time. And we should note that one good feature of the EDAM design is at least the self-scheduling is only in the day-ahead market. So entities that self-schedule in the day-ahead market could still bid their resource into real time, be dispatched economically, and we wouldn't actually, even though the day-ahead commitment, even though the day-ahead schedules might not look right, when we got to real time, the right resources would be dispatched. The caveat to that is that that's not completely true if the self-scheduling and below-cost bidding in EDAM led to changes in the unit commitment, so that some of the units we needed to meet load at least cost weren't even committed, because we self-scheduled so many higher cost resources into that region that the low cost resources didn't get committed. And you can see this creating cascading inefficiency when people say, well, I know I'm going to want that resource to be online in real time, even though it won't get committed, so I better bid it in below cost, and then I'll at minimum load, and then I'll do okay in real time when the prices are higher. Well, this just gives the recipe for more inefficiency and potentially reliability challenges when the day-ahead market schedules aren't really a good guide for the operators of what's going to happen. Go to the next slide. Another change in the EDAM design relative to the Western EIM and an asymmetric change is that we're not going to charge for prevailing flows. We're going to pay for counterflow. But we should note that that's paying for counterflow is efficient, and it won't even result in congestion rent shortfalls if if there's an increase in prevailing flows that are charged for congestion as a result of the counterflow, because you're paying $5 for the counterflow and you're collecting an extra $5 for prevailing flow. So there's no revenue hole. You're doing okay. You break even on that. There might be and that's not really a distortion in the market. The caveat to that is that if you've got these transactions that don't pay congestion, you can get inefficiency and you can get cost shifts in this respect if, when you pay for the counterflow, you're enabling prevailing flow transactions that aren't really economic to flow, because then they're not paying congestion. So then you pay $5 for the counterflow and maybe you collect $1 on the prevailing flow transaction. So you lost $4, and maybe it wasn't even economic to start with. So that's some of the challenges we've got here with the mixed design. Go ahead, one more slide. And we've got this potential for the self-scheduling not only to result in the cost shifts and inflexibility, but entities might go so far as the self-scheduling, either through intent or because of lack of foresight. You can have higher cost resources running when lower cost resources should be running. But again, it's in the day-ahead market, so maybe you can undo it all in real time. Now go ahead and I'll start talking about the kind of things that Milos was bringing up about where do we go. So go to the next slide, please. Okay. Slide 14. No, I want one more slide. Sorry, I guess I got you behind there. Okay. So I don't know the future. If I did, I wouldn't need to be working at all. But it seems to me it's likely that we're going to see some evolution of the Western transmission grid over the next decade. Large loads might not be sited at the same locations as existing loads, so we might see some shifts in where the load is over the next decade. And we also, as we get more intermittent sited, they're probably going to be remote from load, so we may see more more distant flows and different flows than we do today. So this is something we have to keep in mind, that we may not be in exactly the same place in terms of loop flows in 5 years and in 10 years, that we may, just because of these other changes going on, see rising levels of loop flows that are going to put other kinds of stresses on the processes we've got for managing congestion. In the East, what we did as we got open access and we had rising levels of schedules and rising levels of loop flows, much more than we had before, and we found that our we couldn't really deal with them with the contract path system, that this was addressed by TLRs, which started transmission loading relief curtailments that resulted in much higher use of those than had happened historically as we got the higher levels of transaction scheduling. And that really isn't efficient because curtailing and transaction, you might actually be curtailing low cost generation, not high cost generation. It also was difficult from a reliability perspective because you curtail one transaction, another transaction gets scheduled, it may have the same or similar impacts. So you're fighting, and that's, we ended up derating the transmission system in the East because curtailments, TLR curtailments were so inefficient. I actually did data analysis for the MISO back before MISO operations went live, and because of the uncertainty of what was happening, most constraints that were fully loaded hour ahead had flows way below that level in real time because we had scaled everything down because we didn't know what was going to happen. And when we got, the ability to dispatch everybody up and down instead of relying on TLRs, we could fully utilize the transmission system. And that's where we evolved to in the East, is that we shifted over time as we got larger and larger ISOs. When MISO was created and began dispatching generation over a large region and PJM expanded, we shifted to joint congestion management, flow entitlements, and managing all of this through redispatch and paying money instead of trying to curtail transactions in real time to avoid overloads. Let's go on to the next slide. And this is just a slide I carried over. It's got some sites of this, but I'm not going to talk about it again. It's from last year, and I just thought I'd keep it there for people who wanted to look back at it. Look back, go to the next slide, please. And here I'm going to talk a little bit more about Milos, and we talked about this a little bit before, but I'll hit it again. It's not going to be easy to get agreement on changes and setting flow entitlements. Some entities will appear to be winners from uncompensated loop flows and may not want to join joint congestion management and agreements or any agreement limiting parallel flows. But also balancing areas have to be cognizant that, they're both creating flows and they're creating loop flows on others, and some of their power generation isn't going over their system, it's going over other people, and then some of other people's is flowing over them. So setting, it isn't all positives and all positives for the same balancing area, and the pattern might change over the time of day. And you may see that as the world changes, you benefit in some areas of your balancing area and have big problems in other areas. So maybe it'd be good to agree on some limits so that you can understand what you have to deal with when you build your transmission system. And as I said, in the end, if we can't get agreement on negotiated entitlements, filings at FERC will be necessary. And as I said, that's 25 years ago, Dr. Pope and I were making filings on behalf of the NISO and the transmission owners to make those kind of changes in transmission tariff. FERC recognized that some of those agreements were now better than what was signed before because of the ISO, and it was reasonable to require changes to be made. Let me go ahead just a little bit. And I guess I also ought to remember to drive my thought that, back in the MISO, when it was formed, some balancing areas got assigned, counterflow FTRs. Again, they didn't want that, but that's effectively what they had before because they ran their generation to enable the some of the transmission they sold. So that's, keeping a equitable balance of what was happening. Go on to, the next slide here. So, as we talked about, an interim and I think, there's a transition. You can start by defining some kind of flow entitlements. You have to take time to agree on it. So you need to start sooner than later. You might have a fallback of making, filings at FERC. So go to the next slide. It may be we have to, over the next decade, pursue a dual strategy of trying to reach agreement over the next couple of years on joint congestion management and flow entitlements. We'd also have another path of preparing filings at FERC, and maybe we have to have rules and curtailments and other practices that are applied to entities that can't, don't want to agree to those rules, and maybe file for amendments to OAT contracts that are now getting much better than OAT service under the expanded market. The final couple notes, go to the next slide, is to highlight from the way things work standpoint. In the kind of ISO auction that ISOs run, SPP, MISO, ERCOT, PJM, MISO, New York, every constraint is priced in the auction. Every constraint that's binding and has a non-zero price gets priced. And that means that every flow entitlement would get priced in every auction. And when FTRs are valued in the day-ahead market, they're valued by the shadow price of the constraints and the shift factor over that constraint. Well, that same shadow price of the constraint in the day-ahead market is the value of that flow entitlement in the day-ahead market. And you do the same thing in real time. The real-time dispatch prices all of the constraints and it prices all the flow entitlements. So it's something to keep in mind that all these things fit together, and they're like auction revenue rights fitting together with, FTRs, fitting together with day-ahead market schedules, fitting together with a real-time dispatch. So there's ways to work all this stuff into a transition path to FTR type transmission rights, but starting with flow entitlements, and you wouldn't be moving from one paradigm to another. It's really all one paradigm. It's all internally consistent. You're using the same prices to settle them, and you can have the same flow entitlements in the day-ahead market for settling things. So that's kind of trying to respond to Milos's challenge and challenge from other people in the CAISO and the things I've heard. So let me stop here and see if I've got Ben or Jim or Milos or have any questions, and then we can open it to everybody else.
Thank you for engaging with Milos's questions and challenge, Scott. That's a good way to wrap this day. I don't have any questions or comments except to this discussion has shown how that there are a lot of complications. It won't be easy to do this, but I think I still feel that this is worth exploring, that it can avoid hopefully the worst of the inefficiencies that we talked about in the opinion last year that can arise. Let's see, Jim, do you have any comments?
I mean, we can take. It looks like Doug has raised his hand, so why don't we hear from him first?
Okay, Doug, good to hear from you today.
This is Doug Boccignone with Flynn Resource Consultants for the Bay Area Municipal Transmission Group. First, I just want to join the others for thanking Dr. Harvey and Dr. Hobbs for all your contributions over the years. I've learned a lot in participating in this process. Just in terms of the flow entitlements, Dr. Harvey, you mentioned earlier that if you had a mechanism where you had a joint congestion, a CRR market that covered the whole footprint, and I'm just wondering, would you need these steps? If the EDAM BAAs voluntarily participated with the ISO and essentially got alignment between their CRR allocations and their rights that they've sold, would that jump to the or bypass the need for negotiating the entitlements?
Right. You could, if we, I was trying to draw an understanding that FTRs are really just flow entitlements, and like all these things fit together. But if you can't agree on point-to-point FTRs, if that's going to be too difficult to work out, you can start with flow entitlements. And it's not an inconsistency. The flow entitlements can turn into FTRs. And you can start with flow entitlements just defined between PacEast, PacWest, and CAISO. And then PacEast, PacWest, and Portland General. Because you're just talking about their flows on each other's constraints. So you wouldn't need to have the rest of the world. And if you wanted to bring in some of the out customers because you wanted to, you're going to modify their contracts, you can bring them into negotiations too. Well, it doesn't need to involve APS. Doesn't need to agree on flow entitlements with you. They're just in WEAM. They're under WEAM settlements, so you don't have to get the entire world to agree before you figure out what you're going to do with PacEast, PacWest, CAISO, and Portland General. Or then you can move one step further, Nevada, and you don't have to overwhelm yourself by solving it all at once. And Dr. Pope spent several years negotiating helping negotiate the resolution in the MISO. When we were trying to do it all at once, it's good, you've got everybody in the room, but there's a lot to resolve. And if we waited for that, that would delay the resolving things for PacEast, PacWest, CAISO, Portland General, and Nevada. And some people might not ever join EDM. So why do we spend time agreeing on what doesn't matter? So I think, yeah, if we got to the end state of FTRs, if magically Jim would just issue an executive order that said this is what the FTRs are, we wouldn't need this. But I'm thinking of a path that, given we've got these incremental growth in EDM, we can incrementally elaborate our flow entitlements as we need, and only need to reach agreements with the people that are impacted.
Yeah, I think another way of putting it is that, sure, if we had FTRs that just sort of were holistically covering everybody participating, you wouldn't necessarily need to do this mechanism, but you still have to negotiate where the CRR revenue goes and where the congestion revenue underneath that goes. So it's kind of like the same issues. And like Scott said, since these are basically kind of a step towards a form of a FTR, and so we're going to have to cross that bridge sooner or later anyways. But this is a much easier context that can sort of bridge the gap between a traditional kind of outright world that might or might not have to take on a different characteristic. That's sort of up to the BAAs who are selling it. But I think in terms of how the congestion kind of impacts on each neighboring BAA or each participating BAA are kind of shared is something that's going to underlie any solution that will have to be resolved.
Yeah, thanks for both of those. That makes sense to me. I guess I have been assuming sort of the narrower solution, that it would be just those who are participating in the EDAM would be making these changes, and we're still going to have to deal with parallel flow from the non-participants in some manner, just like we do today. And because I think about the OAT rights, you have point-to-point and network rights, but a lot of the rights are point-to-point, and those look a lot like CRRs or FTRs, and those rights aren't, they get curtailed, and they get managed by redispatch, and so if we could create a solution where there's a path towards joining the CRR allocation process as part of that, it seems like we might be able to bypass some of the difficult reconceptualization of this, Flowgate kind of rights.
I don't think you bypass. I agree with Jim. I don't think you're bypassing anything, because you still have to agree on those flow entitlements in order to decide who could get what CRRs. And yeah, if it's a CRR negotiation that's limited to, you know, the CAISO and PAC and Portland General, that's easier. But you know, it's easier to agree on the flow entitlements for those. But if you agree on CRRs, that's more to agree on, because it's all the stuff within too. So if we agree on the external, you know, the flow gate rights on the other balancing area, you know, that's might be easier to agree on than working out the whole FDR design. But once you agree on that part, you know, you can you can settle the FDR auction. You can decide to have an auction. You know who's entitled to what.
I get it. Okay. Thanks for clarifying that.
I guess another metaphor is like the transmission owners in New York have something called ETCNL, which is the historic entitlements to the grid, and that determines who gets the auction revenues. And you know, it's so you still have an auction, and then you have FTRs, TCCs, but you know, how do you decide who gets the money? It's these historic entitlements to the grid, ETCNL. I can't see who's in line, so if one of Jim or Ben, if somehow they've changed the screen on from what I'm using.
Yeah, I don't see anybody queued up. I was just going to say, I don't see a better solution here, or I haven't heard a better solution, you know, short of what Doug was kind of articulating as maybe, you know, the long run end game, but it feels like we're pretty far from that. And I do worry that people have been sort of overly focused on the self-scheduling versus bidding kind of aspect of it, and kind of underappreciating the perverse incentives that even bidding could have if we're not sort of resolving these issues correctly.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Jim. And I mean, that's why, you know, 30 years ago, Hogan came up with financial transmission rights.
Yeah, yeah.
Right. You know, that's why we have them, because we wanted to avoid the use it or lose it incentive. And that was already a problem in the 90s with the yacht world, that there were bad things that sometimes happened because people had an incentive to use their transmission rights in order to get the value. And we knew we needed to break that. So there's a long history of trying to separate the dispatch from the entitlements to use of the transmission system. There's no need to prolong this. If there are no more questions, I think then we can wrap it up. Milos, if you have anything you want to ask.
No, I mean, I think this is very helpful. I guess maybe one question is there a pathway without necessarily moving through the negotiated approach, but going straight to an approach that where, for example, parties can individual balancing areas working with their transmission providers and their transmission customers based on certain eligible transmission rights, they can nominate those rights, and along with CRRs, those are run through a simultaneous feasibility test to determine ultimately, you know, the magnitude of allocation of congestion revenues without necessarily having to go through the individual negotiated approach based on individual constraints and historical information. Do you see a pathway to an application of the simultaneous feasibility test absent the negotiated approach?
The problem with that is that the SFT will probably find you've sold too much, and everybody wants more than there is. And you know, that's why we had to do all this negotiations even in MISO in New York. And New York still curtails the ETCNL because what was sold was more than there is. And you know, you can have a rule that says, well, one guy has to suck up and everybody else gets what they want and someone else has to eat it. Well, that's, you know, the someone else is probably not going to want to be part of the game. So that's why I say, you know, fine, if you can run an SFT and what everybody wants is less than what there is, fine. But I don't think that's the way it's going to turn out on the congested constraints. That's why they're congested. by definition, the constraints with a lot of congestion, there's more demand for it than there is transmission. If it weren't the case, they wouldn't have congestion.
All right, thank you. No, but really appreciate all your insights. I think this is going to be helpful for us to keep in mind as we start on this next phase. So really appreciate all your time and effort and insights that Hill will use here for our next stage.
Great, thanks, Milosh. Glad to help. So Ben or Jim, can you see anybody else? Because if not, we can. I know we're already past the time.
Nobody. I'm not seeing anybody in line at the moment.
Okay.
Somebody had popped in line, but they got out. So thanks again, Milosh, for kicking off the conversation this afternoon and asking the engaging questions. Thank you so much, Scott, for your two presentations. And then, of course, to Guillermo and his team for the analysis and, looking forward to future fruits from their work. So I think at this point, Stacy, we can end the call. Thanks, everybody, for joining us, and wish you a good weekend. Hopefully see you in Folsom at the end of April.
That concludes our conference. You may now disconnect.